The Plaza Hotel, 1988. Ivana Trump takes over an American landmark, 1,200 employees, the most famous address in New York. Her husband announces her salary to reporters, $1 a year plus all the dresses she can buy. She watched her own doormen through binoculars from the apartment upstairs. When two staffers forged a memo promising free Thanksgiving turkeys, she traced the typewriter and fired them both. One had been there 28 years. They called her a tyrant. Nobody asked who built the throne or why the woman they mocked walked away with $14 million and a trademark. Start with the dollar, because everything else in this story runs through it. Donald Trump had just bought the Plaza for close to $400 million, a number that made professional hoteliers wince, and he installed his wife as president. A reporter asked the obvious question, "What are you paying her?" He gave the line about the dresses. It was reported everywhere, repeated for decades. And it worked exactly the way jokes like that always work. It made her sound decorative. It made him sound generous. And it told every executive in that building that the woman about to redesign their lives had no contract, no equity, and no independent claim on anything. She did the job anyway, and she did it hard. She hired a land sale hack who had run the kitchens at Le Cirque and at 21, because the Plaza had been serving canned produce in a room where F. Scott Fitzgerald used to drink. She closed Trader Vic's. She went through the suites picking furniture. A UPI reporter who sat in her office in late 1988 watched her stop mid-sentence to redirect a tray of lemon wedges because she wanted them cut into quarters and sent to the Pomp Court. That's the detail people remember as absurd. It's also the detail that tells you she was reading the hotel the way an owner reads a hotel, in the small stuff, at speed all day. The staff had another word for it. Here's where I want to be careful with you, because this is where the story usually stops being reported and starts being repeated. The binoculars, the turkey memo, the surveillance camera she supposedly kept trained on the employee parking garage in Atlantic City, most of that comes from Harry Hurt III's 1993 book, which was an unfriendly book written during an unfriendly period, and from John O'Donnell, a Trump casino executive who quit in a rage in 1990 and published his own account the following year. Neither man was a neutral witness. Donald himself later said, in a 1997 interview, that what O'Donnell wrote about him was probably true, which is a strange sort of endorsement, but it's the one we have. And Ivana never really denied the temperament. She defended it. After the turkey memo, when the Post asked why she'd fired two people over a prank, she said, "This time it was a turkey, but next time someone might get hurt." That's a manager's answer. A cold one, but a manager's. So the reputation is real. The question the tabloids never bothered with is the one that actually explains it. Who put a woman with no salary, no ownership, and no protection in charge of 1,200 people? And why did he keep telling reporters she worked for clothes? To answer that, you have to go back to a factory town in Czechoslovakia, and to a father who taught his daughter that the only reliable way out of a room is a piece of paper. She was born Ivana Marie Zelnikova in February 1949 in Gottwaldorf, a town built around the Bata Shoe Works, and renamed for a communist president. Her father, Milos Zelnicek, was an electrical engineer. Her mother, Marie, worked at the telephone company. It was a Catholic household in a state that had opinions about Catholic households, and it was, by every account including her own, a happy one, with one organizing obsession. Milos put his daughter on skis very early and kept her there. That was not a hobby. In the Eastern Bloc, athletics was the visa. Sport got you a passport, foreign travel, better housing, a coach who could make a phone call. She was good enough for national youth competition, good enough that the story of her near miss at the 1972 Winter Olympics has followed her ever since. Here, the record gets slippery. For years, the claim circulated that she'd been on the Czechoslovak Olympic ski team. Czech officials disputed it. Most careful accounts now say she was a serious competitor who was passed over for the 1972 squad. Keep that in mind because it's the first appearance of something that runs through her entire life. Ivana understood, long before she met anyone named Trump, that a biography is a document, and documents can be revised. She would spend the 80s as the target of that principle. She'd spend the 90s operating it. She studied at Charles University in Prague, and in 1971, at 22, she got married, not to Donald, to an Austrian ski instructor named Alfred Winkelmeyer, a man she knew from the circuit, in a ceremony that was understood by everyone involved to be an administrative act. It gave her Austrian citizenship. Austrian citizenship gave her the ability to leave Czechoslovakia and come back. which a Czech passport did not. They divorced in 1973. There was no cohabitation to speak of, and no pretense of romance. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it reframes the entire marriage that follows. The first time Ivana Zelnikova signed a marriage certificate, it was a transaction, and she was the one who benefited. Nobody around her thought it was shameful. It was what people did when the alternative was staying. She went to Canada, Montreal, then Toronto, modeling, a little English teaching, the fur ads, the ordinary hustle of a beautiful athlete in her 20s who had already proven she could get herself across a border with nothing but paperwork and nerve. And in 1976, she came to New York with a group of models on a promotional trip tied to the Montreal Olympics, and she went to dinner at Maxwell's Plum, which in that decade was the loudest singles restaurant in Manhattan, and a 30-year-old developer named Donald Trump saw her waiting for a table and got her one. Most of what we know about that night comes from her, told and retold across 40 years, and it stayed remarkably consistent. He paid for the meal. He sent a car. He turned up in Montreal. What did each of them actually see? He was Fred Trump's son, working the outer boroughs, trying to force his way into Manhattan with the Commodore Hotel deal, and he needed something Fred Trump could not buy him. He needed to look continental. A Czech-Austrian skier with a Charles University degree and an accent nobody in Queens could place was not a girlfriend. She was a credential. She was 27, in a country she liked, with a modeling career that had maybe 5 good years left in it, and no plan for year 6. He was not subtle, he was not restful, and he was extremely clear about where he intended to end up. For a woman raised to treat ambition as the family religion, that legibility was probably the most attractive thing about him. There were signals. He was rarely alone with her without an audience. His life ran through his father's office and his father's money. And when the engagement became real, he handed the whole thing to Roy Cohn. Cohn was Joseph McCarthy's former counsel, by then the most feared fixer in New York, and Donald's mentor in the specific art of never conceding anything. Cohn drew up the prenuptial agreement. Ivana's later accounts of that period are consistent on one point. The document blindsided her, the terms were hard, and the discussion of it came uncomfortably close to the wedding. She signed. Think about what she was weighing. She had been in the United States a matter of months on the strength of this relationship. She had a Czech family she wanted to be able to see. She had watched an earlier marriage function perfectly well as a legal instrument. And she was being asked to accept a contract in exchange for a life that, from where she stood in 1977, looked enormous. They married on April 7th, 1977, at Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue. The minister was Norman Vincent Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking and the Trump family's preferred clergyman, a man whose entire body of work argued that confidence produces reality. The reception was at 21. Mayor Abe Beame came. The bride wore a long white dress, and the photographs are lovely. Look at that wedding as an acquisition, and it makes more sense than it does as a romance. The church was his family's, the lawyer was his, the guest list was a real estate developer's guest list. The contract governing what she would receive if it ended had been drafted by the most aggressive litigator in the city and signed by a woman with no lawyer of her own standing. She had traded one kind of visa for another. And that agreement, the one Roy Cohn wrote, was not the last word on what Ivana Trump was worth. Over the next decade, it would be torn up and rewritten again and again, each version arriving at a moment when she had just made herself more useful, and each version pricing her a little more precisely. The first rewrite came before she'd finished decorating his buildings. The second version came in 1978, the year after the wedding and a few months after Donald Jr. was born. Then another in 1984. Then a final one in 1987. 4 agreements in 10 years, each one negotiated by his lawyers, each one arriving after some change in her position. A child, a promotion, a building. Most couples do not repaper their marriage every few years. Corporations do that with vendors whose leverage keeps shifting. By the time she signed the 1987 version, she had 3 children and a professional title, and the number had grown considerably from what Roy Cohn first put in front of her. She would later argue in court that she'd been coerced, that she hadn't understood, that the whole arrangement was fraudulent. A New York judge disagreed and upheld it. That ruling is the single most consequential document in this story, and we'll come back to it, because it is the reason a woman who ran 2 of the most famous properties in America ended up with no independent claim to either. What she got instead was work, not ornamental work. She oversaw the interior of Trump Tower, which opened on Fifth Avenue in 1983 and which sold the entire Trump proposition to the country in a single visual. 6 stories of pink-orange Brescia Perniche marble, brass, water running down a wall. People made fun of it constantly. They also could not stop looking at it, and the apartments sold. Her official title in the organization was Vice President for Interior Design. Understand what that meant in practice. She was inside the company, with authority over contractors and budgets, reporting to a husband who was also her boss, in a firm that had no functioning separation between family and payroll. The Trump organization was not a corporation with a family attached. It was a family with a corporation attached. Fred Trump's money underwrote his son's deals well into the 80s. Fred's judgment hovered over them. The senior executives ate with the family, traveled with the family, and answered to a man who had a documented preference for making his own people fight each other. That preference is where Ivana's reputation actually begins. Barbara Rez was the engineer Donald hired in 1980 to run the construction of Trump Tower, an unusual choice at the time and one he liked to advertise. Louise Sunshine handled political relationships and was, for years, one of the most effective operators in his orbit. Blanche Sprague ran sales. These were serious professionals, and by their own later accounts, the atmosphere among them was competitive to the point of exhaustion, with Ivana in the middle of it, sometimes the aggressor, sometimes the target, always the one who could not be fired by anybody but her husband. Take those memoirs with the appropriate salt. They were written by people who left, some of them bitterly, and every one of them had a book to sell in a market that rewarded Trump stories. But they agree on the structure even when they disagree about who behaved worse. And the structure is the point. He built an office where women with real authority were set against one another, and then he watched. In 1985, he escalated it into something close to farce. He put Ivana in charge of Trump Castle, his casino in Atlantic City, as president and chief executive. She had never run a casino. She moved down there, kept an apartment, worked the floor, learned the business fast enough that people who expected a figurehead stopped expecting one. She also, by the accounts of the men running his other casino down the boardwalk, became a menace. Jack O'Donnell was president of Trump Plaza, the competing property, and his description of that period is specific and unflattering to everybody. Trump funded his wife to compete against his own house for the same high rollers. The 2 casinos bid against each other for the same gamblers with the same company's money. O'Donnell's line about it has been quoted for 35 years. If the Plaza gave a $100,000 player a gold Rolex, the castle gave him 2. When his managers went to Donald and told him the arrangement was insane, O'Donnell says Trump waved it off. "What are you worried about Ivana for?" he told one executive. "She's just a woman. She can't take the business." Read that quote twice. He set her up in a competing operation, financed her to outspend his own people, and then told his own people she was nothing to worry about. Every dollar she won made her the enemy of the men who worked for her husband. Every dollar she lost proved his point. And the harder she worked to survive inside that, the more she behaved exactly the way the record says she behaved. Watching everyone, trusting nobody, monitoring the staff, spending to win. The tyranny wasn't a personality, it was a job description. She spent $70 million adding a tower to the castle, an expansion the Atlantic City market did not need, in a war she had not started. And in 1988, Donald pulled her out of Atlantic City and sent her back to New York to run the Plaza. A move O'Donnell explicitly frames as an exile rather than a promotion, though he was, again, a man with grievances. That is the appointment that produced the $1-a-year line. She arrived at the Plaza with a reputation for ruthlessness she had earned in a fight her husband engineered, and he introduced her to the American press as a woman he paid in clothing. She responded by getting louder, not quieter. She told reporters her goal was 5 stars. She replaced managers. She was, by every account of the period, everywhere in that hotel at all hours, which is how you end up with the binoculars story and the newspapers, blown against the wall story and the profanity that hurt reports and nobody has ever seriously disputed. 1,200 people worked for her. Not one of them could have told you what she was paid, because the answer was nothing. There's a version of this where she's simply a bad boss, and the staff resentment is the whole story. I don't think the evidence supports that, and here's the tell. The same New York that mocked her also could not get enough of her. She was on magazine covers, at every benefit, quoted constantly. Whatever the Plaza's night managers thought of her, the city treated her as the one member of that marriage who had actually built something. Which brings us to the part of the 80s that looks, in photographs, like the happiest. There were 3 children now. Donald Jr. in 1977, Ivanka in 1981, Eric in 1984, raised substantially by nannies. Most importantly, Dorothy Curry, who stayed with the family for decades, and whom Ivana would still be providing for in her will 38 years later. Ivana became an American citizen in 1988. They had Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, the triplex above Trump Tower, the yacht, the helicopter with the name on the side. And they worked well together. That's not sentiment, it's the record. Two people who both got up early, both wanted the same thing, both understood that the product they were selling was themselves. Whatever else that marriage was, for about 10 years it was an effective commercial partnership between people who genuinely enjoyed winning. It also had, by 1989, a third participant. Donald had been involved with Marla Maples, an actress from Georgia in her mid-20s, for a period the participants have never precisely agreed on. The relationship was not a secret inside their social world. O'Donnell's book describes Trump Plaza staff quietly accommodating her presence in Atlantic City. Marla herself later said Ivana had to know. Whether she knew is one thing. Being made to know is another. That December, the family went to Aspen for the Christmas holiday, as they did most years. Marla Maples was also in Aspen. Multiple accounts, including biographies published in 2017, conclude that Trump had arranged for her to be there while his wife and 3 children were on the mountain. They met at a restaurant on the slopes. Ivana's own version, published in her 2017 memoir, is short, and she never varied it. A young blonde woman came up to her and said she was Marla, and that she loved Ivana's husband, and asked whether Ivana did too. Ivana told her to get lost. She wrote that it was unladylike, and that she was in shock. It's a lean account. No dialogue beyond those lines, no scene setting. She was a woman who had learned to give the press exactly as much as she intended to give. Now the escape route. Any reasonable person watching this would ask why she didn't leave that week. The answer is a list, and every item on it was assembled by somebody else. There was the 1987 agreement, which a court would soon confirm was binding. There was her job, which existed only because her husband said it did, and which he could end with a phone call. There were 3 children, one of whom, Donald Jr., would stop speaking to his father for a year after the split. There was a citizenship 4 years newer than the marriage. And there was the fact that everything she owned, wore, ran, or lived in had his name on the front of it. She had gotten out of Czechoslovakia with paperwork. This time, the paperwork was on the other side. So she went back to New York, back to the plaza, and kept working through January while it all sat there. Then, in February, she picked up a telephone and called a woman she'd been having lunch with for years. The woman was Liz Smith, the Daily News gossip columnist, the most read practitioner of the trade in America, and a friend of both Trumps. She'd been photographed with them at the Big Apple Circus 2 years earlier. Ivana asked her to come to the plaza. Smith described that meeting in interviews for the rest of her life, most fully to NPR in 2009. Ivana told her Donald didn't want her anymore. And Smith, who had spent 30 years watching rich people lose control of their own stories, gave her one piece of advice. Get a respectable public relations person and defend yourself. Smith's column ran on February 11, 1990. It said the marriage was over. What followed was the loudest 11 days in the history of American tabloid journalism. The Daily News put the Trumps on the front page every day and watched circulation climb by 30 to 40,000 copies. Smith had Ivana, the New York Post had Cindy Adams, and the Post had Donald. And this is the betrayal that actually mattered, not the affair, which was ordinary, but what he did with the newspapers. The Post ran the headline, "Best Sex I've Ever Had," attributed to Marla Maples, over a photograph of Donald. Reporters at the time and since have concluded he supplied it himself, in retaliation for something in the Daily News that had annoyed him. Marla has spent 35 years saying she never told anyone that. He was, by then, a practiced hand at this. He phoned reporters pretending to be a publicist named John Barron. In 1991, he called a People magazine writer Sue Carswell as John Miller, and talked for 20 minutes about how many women wanted Donald Trump. Carswell kept the tape. So a man who had installed his wife in a job with no salary, told the country he paid her in dresses, financed her into a war with his own executives, and arranged for his girlfriend to be on the same mountain as his children, was now anonymously feeding the New York press bulletins about his own sexual performance while she was still going to work every morning at his hotel. She stopped being able to do that in the fall. The plaza was drowning. Donald's whole empire was, and by the summer of 1990, his banks were effectively running his finances. Ivana was removed as president and replaced by professional operators brought in to cut. Christopher Nabel, then the hotel's director of guest services, described what that year was like inside the building. A painful place to work, laying off staff during the holidays with the house full. Her father died that year. Milos Zelnicek, the engineer who put her on skis, was 63. Donald flew with her to Czechoslovakia for the funeral. There was a truce of sorts around it. It did not survive the return flight. Then came the depositions, and the ugliest document in the file. In sworn testimony during the divorce, drawing on an incident from 1989, Ivana used the word rape. When the account surfaced publicly in 1993 in Harry Hurt's book, she issued a statement, prepared with Donald's lawyers, which matters, saying she had used the word, but did not want it interpreted in a literal or criminal sense. She restated that in 2015 when the story resurfaced during his campaign, and called their relationship at that point close. He has always denied it. I'm going to leave it there, because both of her statements were made under legal and financial pressure, and anyone who tells you the record is clean is selling something. The divorce was granted in December 1990, uncontested, on grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment by Donald. She got custody. Her lawyers had opened by seeking a share of the empire, reportedly $150 million, and the plaza itself. Then the court upheld the 1987 agreement, and then it became obvious there was very little empire left to divide. By the time the post-divorce settlement closed in 1991, she had roughly $14 million in cash, the Greenwich estate, an apartment, child support, and the right to use Mar-a-Lago 1 month a year. And a clause. She had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. She was required to get his permission before speaking publicly about the marriage. He bought her silence for $14 million and a house, which would be the end of it, except that he had spent 13 years teaching her exactly how the machine worked, and she had been taking notes the whole time. Watch what she does next, because none of it is passive. She trademarked her own name. That is the single smartest thing anyone in this story ever did, because the name was legally his family's, commercially his, and she carved out the right to sell it. Then she sold it. Clothing, jewelry, and beauty lines on QVC and the Home Shopping Network. A 2-book fiction deal reported at $1 million. A novel in 1992 about a Czech skier who marries a rich American and runs a Manhattan hotel, which she insisted was not autobiographical. From 1995 to 2010, she wrote an advice column for the Globe called Ask Ivana. 15 years of a tabloid dispensing her opinions to American women, in the same supermarket racks that had spent 1990 humiliating her. In 1996, she appeared as herself in the First Wives Club, and delivered the line that outlived everything else she ever said. Don't get mad, get everything. She had not gotten everything. The court had seen to that. But she understood, better than her ex-husband ever did, that the version people repeat becomes the version that's true, and she had just written hers into a hit movie. There's the reversal. The tyrant the tabloids built in 1990 became a product she owned by 1996. The woman priced at $1 a year spent the next quarter century collecting the royalties on her own caricature. The NDA held, though. That's the part people forget when they call this a happy ending. When she published Raising Trump in 2017, with her ex-husband in the White House, the book was warm. She wrote glowingly about the marriage and her role in the company. She wrote about the pain the affair caused the children, about Don Jr. not speaking to his father for a year, about how insane the coverage had been. But the memoir of the most public divorce in American history was, by design and by contract, a friendly one. She had the persona, he had the paperwork. That was the final arrangement, and it lasted until she died. She fell at her home on the Upper East Side in July 2022 at 73. The medical examiner ruled it accidental. She left an estate of about $34 million, most of it split between Don Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, with bequests to a friend and to Dorothy Curry, the nanny, still on the list, 45 years later. They held the funeral at St. Vincent Ferrer on Lexington, and then they drove her to New Jersey and buried her at Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, in a plot near the clubhouse, beside the first hole. Reporting after the burial noted something about that ground. Documents published by ProPublica showed the Trump Family Trust had previously explored designating land as a nonprofit cemetery company. And under New Jersey law, property used for cemetery purposes carries exemptions from real estate tax, income tax, sales tax, and inheritance tax. Nobody has proven that's why she's there. But the question was obvious enough that Fortune ran it under a headline asking it directly, and the family has never given a fuller answer. Now go back to 1988 and the dollar. The joke about the dresses worked because it sounded like affection. It was a valuation. He was telling a room full of reporters, on the record, that his wife's labor had a price and the price was zero. And then he spent 13 years extracting the labor anyway. In a casino, in a hotel, in a marriage he repapered 4 times. She never quite escaped that. She escaped almost everything else. She got out of a communist factory town on a marriage certificate and a pair of skis, out of a bad settlement with a trademark, out of a tabloid war with a movie line. But the last piece of paper in her life was still one of his, and the last address she ever had was a Trump property. He priced her at $1 a year, and 34 years later he still had her on the books. There's a photograph Ivana Trump chose to publish herself, 40 years after it was taken. April 1977. Fred and Marianne Trump on one side, Ivana's father and aunt on the other, the bride in white between them. 2 families joined. That's the picture. Here's what isn't in it. Before that ceremony, Ivana had signed a contract drafted by Roy Cohn, and one draft demanded she return every gift her husband ever gave her. She renegotiated it 4 times, and the most damaging remark ever attributed to her mother-in-law wasn't aimed at Ivana at all. It was about her son. The line surfaced in September 1990 in Marie Brenner's Vanity Fair piece on the collapse of the Trump marriage. Donald's mother, Brenner reported, had asked Ivana what kind of son she had created. 7 words. They'd been recycled for 35 years as proof of a chilly Scottish matriarch who never warmed to the Czech girl from Queens by way of Zlín. Read it again. It isn't contempt for Ivana. It's a mother looking at her son's public conduct and not recognizing him. If anything, it puts Marianne McLeod Trump on Ivana's side of the table. So where did the story of the hostile mother-in-law come from? It came from the same place almost everything we think we know about that marriage came from. It came through Ivana's people, at the exact moment Ivana was fighting for her financial life. And that is the actual story here, not whether an 88-year-old woman from the Isle of Lewis privately disliked her daughter-in-law, which no surviving document can tell you, but what happened to a woman who married into a family that had no seat for wives, and what she did about it. Start with what Ivana already knew before she ever met a Trump. She was born Ivana Zelníková in 1949 in what was then Gottwaldhof, a factory town renamed for a communist president, in a country where leaving was the hardest thing a person could do. Her father, Milos, an electrical engineer, pushed her onto skis young and pushed hard. She was good enough for the competitive circuit, good enough to travel, which in that system was the whole point. Travel was the currency. Travel was the exit. And Ivana found the exit the way a practical person does. In 1971, she married an Austrian ski instructor named Alfred Winkelmeyer. The marriage got her an Austrian passport, which meant she could leave Czechoslovakia and still come home to see her parents without being branded a defector. She has never pretended otherwise. 2 years later, with Winkelmeyer teaching in California, she obtained a divorce in absentia in Los Angeles. Sit with that a second, because it explains the next 20 years. Before she was 25, Ivana had used a marriage as a legal instrument, executed it cleanly, and dissolved it without drama. She understood a wedding as paperwork with a purpose. When Roy Cohn slid a prenuptial agreement across a table at her in 1977, she was not a naive girl encountering the concept of contractual love for the first time. She was the only person in the room who had already done it once. There's a wrinkle in her family's story that surfaced much later, and it's worth flagging because it shows how little of this life was ever fully private. Czech secret police files reported on by The Guardian and others indicate that Milos Zelníková was cultivated as an informer by the STB, passing along what his daughter told him from New York, including, at one point, a prediction about the 1988 American election. There's no evidence Ivana knew, but the woman who would spend the 1990s accused of leaking her own marriage to the press had grown up in a household where information moved upward, whether you consented or not. By the mid-70s, she was in Montreal, modeling, living with a fellow Czech skier named George Siravatka. In the summer of 1976, she came to New York with a group of models, part of the promotional churn around the Montreal Olympics. She was 27. Donald Trump was about to turn 30. He was, at that moment, almost entirely potential. The Grand Hyatt deal hadn't closed. Trump Tower was a fantasy. What he had was his father's money, his father's political connections in Brooklyn and Queens, and Roy Cohn's phone number. What he did with Ivana was pure Donald. He got her table a reservation at a restaurant she and her friends couldn't get into. He picked up the check. He put her in a car home. Roses the next day. A trip to Montreal a few weeks later. Then she was back in New York being driven around in a car with DJT plates. Understand what each of them was actually buying, because it wasn't a romance novel. He was getting a European woman with athletic credentials, a hard work ethic, real design instincts, and an accent that sounded like money to people who didn't know any better. She was getting Manhattan. She was also getting a man who, by every contemporary account, worked constantly and drank nothing, which, for a woman raised in a culture of heavy drinking and modest ceilings, was not nothing. He also pushed. Ivana said in interviews decades later that for months he told her she'd ruin her life if she didn't marry him. That's her recollection, given at 70 after a lifetime of shaping her own story, and it should be held a little loosely. But the timeline supports urgency. They met in the summer. They were married before the following Easter. Somewhere in there, he took her out to Jamaica Estates to meet his parents. The house on Wareham Place was large by Queen's standards and invisible by Manhattan ones. A solid brick colonial with white columns, the home of a man worth an enormous amount of money who had never once behaved like it. Fred Trump wore a suit and tie to inspect boiler rooms. Harry Hurt III, writing in 1993, described Mary Ann collecting coins out of the laundry machines in the family's apartment buildings. The family has told versions of that story about several different Trump women, so treat it as folklore with a factual spine. The spine is what matters. This was a household where money was a thing you counted, not a thing you displayed. Into that came Ivana, who would go on to sell her own line of jewelry on television. Mary Ann MacLeod was 64 that year. She had come from Tong, on the Isle of Lewis, a Gaelic-speaking village at the edge of Scotland, and arrived in New York in 1930 with almost nothing. She married Fred in 1936. The reception was for 25 people at the Carlisle. They honeymooned in Atlantic City and went back to work. Now compare that to what her son did 9 months after meeting a woman. The wedding was in the first week of April 1977 at Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue, officiated by Norman Vincent Peale, the Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking, the closest thing mid-century America had to a celebrity minister. There were hundreds of guests. The reception was at the 21 Club. Newspapers covered it. This was not a family joining another family. This was a launch. And before any of it happened, there was the contract. In March 1977, roughly 6 months into the relationship, Ivana sat down to negotiate a prenuptial agreement drafted by Roy Cohn, McCarthy's former counsel, mob lawyer, Trump's fixer, the man who taught Donald that you never settle and never apologize. One clause required Ivana to hand back every piece of jewelry Donald had ever given her if the marriage ended. She reportedly walked out of the room over it. In a 1990 deposition, she said she'd been hurt by that part, and confused. She didn't understand why gifts given to her during a marriage would revert to the man who gave them. She also wanted a cushion. She asked for $150,000 as a rainy day fund, on the reasoning that she was giving up her own earning career. She got $100,000. The jewelry clause came out. Donald blamed the lawyer. Here's the detail people skip. She didn't just sign it and forget it. In 1979, she reopened the agreement and the divorce fund went to $750,000. She reopened it again in 1984 and again in 1987. 4 versions in 10 years, each one tracking the rise of his balance sheet. Every retelling of this marriage treats that prenup as the leash. It was also the only asset in that family that a wife was permitted to touch, and Ivana touched it repeatedly, upward, for a decade. Keep that in mind, because in 1990, it becomes the thing she attacks with everything she has, and the thing that nearly ruins her. She married into a corporation that happened to serve dinner. Fred sat at the head of the table into his 80s. Fred's money paid for things long after his children were adults. Fred decided what a Trump was. Donald would later credit his mother with his instinct for spectacle. He wrote in The Art of the Deal that he got some of his sense of showmanship from her. And that's true as far as it goes. But Mary Ann's showmanship went into charity luncheons and the women's auxiliary at Jamaica Hospital. She had 5 children, a Rolls Royce with her initials on the plate, and no equity in anything. That was the arrangement Ivana had just joined. Wives in that family were staff with better clothes. She was pregnant almost immediately. Donald Jr. was born on the last day of 1977, less than 9 months after the wedding, and within a few years Ivana was on construction sites. In a hard hat and heels with a clipboard, running the interior design of the Grand Hyatt, and then Trump Tower. She was not going to be furniture, which is precisely when the family's problem with her began. Not that she was foreign or flashy or ambitious in the abstract. It was that she started getting her own press. Through the first half of the 1980s, the Trumps were the most photographed couple in New York, and the photographs were doing real work. He put her in charge of things. That part is often flattened into a joke, but it wasn't one. In 1985, Ivana became president of Trump's castle in Atlantic City, running a casino with roughly 4,000 employees, as she pointed out later, and nobody has successfully contradicted her. The only woman in that job at any casino anywhere. 3 years later, he moved her to the Plaza Hotel after buying it, and in 1990 she was named Hotelier of the Year. And here is how he described the arrangement in public to reporters. He paid his wife $1 a year and all the dresses she could buy. He said it repeatedly. It got laughs. It was also, functionally, a true description of her legal position. She ran 2 of his largest assets and owned none of it, and her compensation was a line in a prenuptial agreement she had to renegotiate every few years to keep current with his net worth. Ivana was not stupid about this. She was doing something with the exposure. By the mid-'80s, she had reached the point where, according to Marie Brenner, she handed interviewers a press kit of her own flattering clippings. Think about what that means. The wife in a family that had spent 50 years cultivating obscurity in Queens was maintaining a personal media file. That was the wedge. Not her accent, not her spending. Her byline. Now go to Palm Beach in the spring of 1986. The Trumps had just bought Mar-a-Lago, Marjorie Merriweather Post's 118-room house, and were hosting dinners for a Palm Beach establishment that hadn't decided yet whether to be amused by them. Donald was announcing an old custom at a house he'd owned for a few months. Guests were being asked to stand and introduce themselves, like a sales conference. Ivana was seated at the far end of a long table. Brenner was there. Her observation from that night is the single most quoted line about the interior of that marriage, and she published it 4 years later, in September 1990. That they never seemed to touch or say anything intimate in public, and that they had come to resemble 2 ambassadors from different countries, each working a separate brief. That was 1986. The peak. The year Donald was on television offering to negotiate arms deals with the Soviets, and people were floating him for president. The public image of that marriage and the private condition of it had already separated by half a decade before America found out. They had 2 more children by then, Ivanka in 1981, Eric in 1984, and Ivana ran that side of it the way she ran everything, on a schedule, with nannies and rules, and breakfast every morning without exception. She has said flatly that she raised them alone, that Donald was making deals, that he didn't know how to talk to small children and only became interested when they turned 21. Her children have not disputed it. Neither has he. So by 1988, you have a marriage that functions as a business, a wife who is very good at the business, a husband who is over-leveraged and starting to unravel, and no mechanism anywhere in that family for either of them to say so. Then, Marla Maples. The affair began around 1985 or 1986, depending on which account you believe, and it was not discreet. Casino people in Atlantic City talked about it openly afterward. One trade journal editor said Maples spent a summer on the Trump Princess, the yacht, and was moved off it when Ivana was coming. That's a second-hand recollection from an interested industry, so hold it loosely, but the general pattern of a lover kept inside the same social and business geography as the wife is corroborated by too many sources to dismiss. Ivana's own account of finding out is the one everybody knows, and it's worth noting that we only have it because she chose to publish it in her 2017 memoir, 40 years after the wedding. Aspen, December 1989. The family was skiing. A young blonde woman came up to her on the mountain and told her she loved Ivana's husband, and asked whether Ivana did. Ivana's reply, by her own telling, "Get lost, I love my husband." Then she added, in print, that this was unladylike, and that she was in shock. She knew right then, she wrote, that it was over. She did not act like a woman who thought it was over. She acted like a woman who had 8 weeks to prepare. February 1990. The Chicago Tribune reported that Donald had Ivana locked out of her own office at the plaza. Not eased out. Locked out. The president of the hotel, the hotelier of the year, arrived at a building she ran and could not get into her room. That's the moment the marriage stopped being a marriage and became litigation. And the thing they litigated was the prenup. Ivana's lawyers went after all 4 versions of it, arguing they should be thrown out. Donald's position was that a deal is a deal 4 times over. This is where her decade of careful upward renegotiation turned on her. Every time she had reopened that agreement and signed a better one, she had also demonstrated that she understood it, negotiated it with counsel, and accepted it. Cohn was dead by then, of AIDS, in 1986. His paperwork outlived him and did exactly what he'd built it to do. Meanwhile, the tabloids ate the family alive. The New York Post ran the headline about Marla and the sex, which is the single most famous artifact of that entire divorce, and which nobody has ever definitively sourced to Maples herself. It ran in February 1990. It was on newsstands in every borough where Fred Trump owned buildings. That's the context for the remark at the center of this whole story. Somewhere in that year, according to Brenner's reporting, Marianne Trump asked her daughter-in-law what kind of son she had created. She was 78. Her husband was declining. Her eldest son, Freddie, had died in 1981 at 42, and the family had never really discussed it. And her second son's mistress was on the cover of the Post. The line is second-hand. It came to a magazine reporter, in a piece sourced heavily from Ivana's side, at the precise moment Ivana needed public sympathy to pressure a settlement. That doesn't make it false. Brenner was a serious journalist, and the piece has held up better than almost anything written about Trump in that era. But it does mean the only sentence we have about how Donald's mother felt during her son's divorce reached us through the divorcing wife's own publicity operation, which is a strange way for a woman to prove her mother-in-law hated her. Now, the hardest part of the record, and I'm going to handle it once and move on. In a 1990 divorce deposition, Ivana described an incident from 1989 in which she said her husband assaulted her. The deposition was sealed. Harry Hurt III obtained the account and published it in his 1993 book. Before that book came out, Ivana issued a statement, printed in the book itself, saying that she had used the word in the deposition, but did not intend it in a literal or criminal sense. She repeated that clarification in 2015 when the story resurfaced during the campaign, calling it a moment of very high tension in the divorce. Donald Trump has denied the account entirely, including the surgery that supposedly preceded it. Those are the facts of the record as it stands. 2 documented statements from the same woman, years apart, pointing in different directions. One of them made while she was still bound by an agreement that governed what she could say about him. You can draw your own conclusion. What you cannot do is pretend the record is clean. October 1990. Ivana's father, Milos, died suddenly of a heart attack in Czechoslovakia. He was 63, and Donald Trump got on a plane and stood next to his estranged wife at her father's funeral in Zlin in November, in the middle of the ugliest divorce in America, while their lawyers were still tearing at each other in New York. Do not romanticize it and do not dismiss it. Both things are documented. The man was capable of showing up. He also, within weeks, was back to fighting her over money. The divorce was granted in December 1990 on grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment. The financial settlement took longer and produced roughly $14 million, the Greenwich House, an apartment in Trump Plaza, and the right to use Mar-a-Lago for 1 month a year. A clause worth noticing, because it meant she retained a key to the house where Brenner had watched the marriage die. And it came with a confidentiality provision. Ivana could not discuss the divorce or the marriage without his permission. She had spent her adult life understanding that a contract is just a starting position. In 1992, she published a novel called For Love Alone, about a Czech woman who marries a rich American and is betrayed. Fiction. Legally, fiction. Donald sued her for $25 million, arguing it violated the confidentiality clause. She had found the one door the agreement didn't quite cover, and he had to go into court and argue that a made-up story about a made-up husband was actually about him. Then she did something the family found genuinely unforgivable. She went on television and sold things. House of Ivana went on to HSN in Tampa, then QVC in London, then the Shopping Channel in Canada. Clothing, fragrance, jewelry. She has claimed tens of millions in sales, which is her number, and unaudited. But the volume was real enough that she was still doing it 2 decades later. Understand what that meant in the family she had married into. Fred Trump built apartment buildings in Brooklyn and collected rent. Marianne volunteered at Jamaica Hospital. The entire Trump architecture, going back 3 generations, was based on owning the ground under something. Ivana went on cable television at 2 in the afternoon and sold rhinestones to strangers using a name the family considered theirs. She also went on Oprah. She gave interviews. In 1991, Donald cut off her payments after one of them and threatened to sue her for damages. She came back to that same show in 1992 and said, on camera, that she would not let men dominate her anymore. And then in 1996, she walked into a movie theater's worth of cultural memory in about 9 seconds. In the First Wives Club, playing herself, she told a room of discarded wives to be strong and independent, and not to get mad, to get everything. That line is now more famous than any building she ever designed. It's her actual monument. A woman who ran a casino and a hotel and 3 of Donald Trump's construction projects is best remembered for one sentence of screen advice about divorce, delivered by herself, as herself, on purpose. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of the title of this story was leaving the field entirely. On Halloween night, 1991, Ivana Trump was mugged on Union Turnpike, near her home, by a 16-year-old who threw her down and took her purse. There were $14 in it. She suffered broken ribs and a brain hemorrhage, and the damage to her sight and hearing was permanent. She was 79, and she already had severe osteoporosis, a consequence of the emergency surgery she'd barely survived after Robert's birth in 1948, 4 operations in about 2 weeks, according to what her daughter Marianne told the biographer Gwenda Blair. She was never physically the same after that. The mugging finished it. A bread delivery man named Lawrence Herbert chased the kid down and held him for police. Donald tracked Herbert down afterward and took him to dinner at the Plaza. It made the papers. Of course it made the papers. Marianne lived 9 more years. Fred died in June 1999. She died on the 7th of August, 2000, at 88, at Long Island Jewish Medical Center. The death notice that ran back home in the Stornoway Gazette identified her as the daughter of Malcolm and Mary McLeod of 5 Tong. Much missed. She never gave an interview about Ivana. Not one. Not during the divorce, not during the tabloid year, not in the decade afterward when she could have said anything she wanted to any reporter in New York and been on the front page by morning. Neither did Fred. So here is where the title lands, and it does not land where you expect. Every account of Marianne McLeod Trump disliking her daughter-in-law traces back through other people. Ivana's friends, Ivana's circle, reporters working Ivana's side of a divorce. The one remark that survives in print puts the old woman's judgment squarely on her son. There is no letter. There is no diary. There is no recording. There is a family that did not talk, and there is a daughter-in-law who talked constantly, and everything we believe about the silence was reconstructed by the person who broke it. That is not the same as saying they were close. They plainly weren't. Ivana was warmer about Fred than about Marianne in her own telling, and she barely wrote about her mother-in-law at all in a memoir, where she found room for nannies and ski instructors. The absence is its own kind of evidence. A woman who spent 4 decades documenting her life in print left a blank space where Marianne should have been. But the coldness wasn't personal in the way the title promises. It was structural. That family had one seat with authority in it, and Fred sat in it until he was too old to sit anywhere. Everyone else, wives, daughters, the son who died at 42, arranged themselves around it. Marianne had been living in that arrangement since 1936 without complaint or equity. Then a Czech skier arrived, took the job description, and rewrote it in public. You can call that hatred. I think it was something more useful to know about. A household that had no idea what to do with a woman who wouldn't stay backstage. And the strangest turn is what happened to the record afterward. Donald had the confidentiality clause. He had the money, the buildings, the name, and eventually the presidency. He had every instrument you would need to control how a marriage is remembered. Ivana published, "Anyway." In 2017, with her ex-husband in the White House and every camera in the country pointed at the family, she brought out Raising Trump and went on morning television and said she was the first Trump wife, so she was the first lady, and that she had a direct line to the White House, but didn't want to cause jealousy. Melania's office issued a statement calling it attention-seeking noise. Ivana kept talking. She said she'd been offered the ambassadorship to Prague and turned it down because her life was already perfect. She was 68 and she was still setting the terms. She died on the 14th of July, 2022, at her townhouse on the Upper East Side at 73. That October, the Czech state gave her a posthumous honor, and her daughter went to Prague to accept it, the girl from Gottwaldorf, decorated by the country she'd needed a fake Austrian marriage to legally leave. She was buried at Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey. on his land, under a small stone beside the first tee. Read that however you want. The family put her on the property permanently, which is either the last word in possession or the last word in belonging. And I don't think anyone involved could tell you which. Now go back to the photograph. April 1977. Fred and Mary Ann on one side, Milos Zelnicek and Ivana's aunt on the other. Two families, one bride, the whole thing looking exactly like what a wedding is supposed to look like. Almost everyone in it is compromised by what came later. Milos was reporting to the secret police. The contract in the bride's file had been drafted by Roy Cohn and would be rewritten 4 times. The groom would be photographed with someone else within a decade. And the mother-in-law standing there in her good coat would never say a public word about the woman beside her, and would still end up cast, permanently, as the villain of her daughter-in-law's story. She didn't publish that picture. Fred didn't. Donald didn't. Ivana did. In her own book, on her own schedule, when everyone in it but her was dead and could not object. That's the answer to the question the title asks. There is no evidence Donald Trump's mother hated Ivana Trump. What there is a family that kept its mouth shut for 100 years, and a woman who understood, from the moment she first used a marriage license as a travel document, that the person who tells the story owns it. They had the buildings. She kept the negatives. April 1988. Donald Trump sits on Oprah's couch and says that, ultimately, Ivana does exactly as he tells her to do. She laughs. The audience laughs. That same spring, he handed her the Plaza Hotel and announced her salary in public. $1 a year, plus all the dresses she could buy. She had already signed 4 prenuptial agreements. Within 18 months, she'd be locked out of her own office in that hotel. Then she called a gossip columnist to the Plaza and buried him on 11 straight front pages. To understand how she did it, start in Prague, 1971. The salary line was a joke, and everybody in the room understood it as a joke. And that's exactly why it worked. He just paid something close to $400 million for the Plaza. He put his wife in charge of it. A reporter asked what he was paying her, and he said, $1 a year, and all the dresses she can buy. It ran everywhere. Harry Hurt III, who reported on the Trumps through the divorce, described her as haunted by that line, striving, in his telling, to earn her keep and keep her self-esteem at the same time. She wasn't decorative. Whatever else you want to say about the marriage, she worked. Executive Vice President for Interior Design. The pink marble in Trump Tower is hers. In the mid-'80s, she ran Trump Castle in Atlantic City as president and chief executive. Then the Plaza, where she reportedly spent tens of millions on the restoration, rewrote the staff dress code, changed the carpets, and this detail is from her own interviews at the time, insisted that every wedge of lemon be cut the same way. So here's the first thing worth sitting with. A woman running a landmark hotel for $1 and a wardrobe is not a punchline about a spoiled wife. It's a compensation structure. And a compensation structure is a form of control. She understood publicity as well as he did, which is why I'm going to spoil one of her stories immediately. In 1988, she told American journalists she'd been an alternate on the Czechoslovak ski team at the 1972 Winter Olympics, downhill and slalom. It has been repeated in obituaries for decades. It isn't true. Czechoslovakia sent 4 women to those games, and none of them were alpine skiers. In 1989, Pomerzny, Secretary General of the Czechoslovak Olympic Committee, said flatly that he'd searched and found no record of her. Snopes went back over it in 2021 and confirmed the same thing. That's not a small correction. It tells you she was building a version of herself long before she met anybody named Trump. She just had a much harder set of materials to work with. She was born Ivana Marie Zelnikova in February 1949, in a town the communists had recently renamed Gottwaldov after the country's first working-class president. It's Zlin again now. Her father, Milos, was an electrical engineer. Her mother worked as a telephone operator. Milos put her on skis at 4 and pushed hard. And the payoff wasn't medals. It was the junior national team, which meant travel documents, which meant crossing a border that most of her neighbors would never cross. She took a master's in physical education at Charles University in Prague. In 1970, she turned up in a children's television series. She was good-looking, athletic, multilingual, and stuck. And in November 1971, at 22, she solved it. She married an Austrian ski instructor named Alfred Winkelmeyer. He was a friend. Every credible account, including her own and her lawyers', says the marriage was never consummated and was never meant to be. She got the Austrian passport in March 1972, and notice the specific shape of the maneuver. She did not defect. Defectors couldn't go home. She wanted a document that let her leave and still return to see her parents, and that's precisely what she got. In August 1973, she took an absentee divorce in Los Angeles, where Winkelmeyer had gone to teach skiing. Keep that in mind. Before she was 25, Ivana had learned that a marriage certificate is a legal instrument, that it can be entered into for reasons that have nothing to do with feeling, and that the important clause is the one that lets you out. She had a real life in Prague, too, and it ended badly. She was involved with Jiří Stadl, a lyricist and playwright who was killed in a car accident in 1973. After that, she went to Canada. In Montreal, she lived with George Siravatka, a Czech who'd defected in 1971 and ran a ski boutique. She told people the two of them were married. They never were. She taught skiing, modeled for Eaton's and the designer Åke Samft, did promotional work around the 1976 Olympics, and took night classes at McGill to sharpen her English. She told the Montreal Gazette in 1975 that modeling was a job, not a career. That's the woman who came to New York in 1976 with a group of models and met a 30-year-old developer from Queens who was, at that point, mostly a rumor about himself. Look at what each of them actually saw. He saw a European with a graduate degree, 4 or 5 languages, a face that photographed well, and an appetite for work that matched his own. One reviewer of the later documentary series put it about right. He chose a life partner deliberately, someone to work beside him and push back. She saw a man with access to Manhattan, a family with money, and, after Czechoslovakia, after Montreal, after living as somebody's not-quite wife, a permanent place to stand. Neither of them was being irrational. Both of them were making an acquisition. Which brings us to the first document. In March 1977, after roughly 6 months together, they sat down to negotiate a prenuptial agreement. The account we have of that room comes mainly from Hertz reporting and from contemporaneous press, so treat the details as reconstruction rather than transcript. But the substance is not in dispute, because the agreement itself became the spine of everything that followed. He wanted a clause requiring her to hand back the jewelry he'd given her if the marriage ended. She walked out over it. She wanted a cash cushion in the event of divorce and asked for $150,000. She settled for $100,000. The lawyer drafting for the Trump side was Roy Cohn. Think about the sequence, because the sequence is the story. 6 years earlier, she had used a marriage to get out of one system. Now, she was signing her way into another one. And this time, the paperwork was written by Joseph McCarthy's former counsel. They married on April 9th, 1977, at Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue. The officiant was Norman Vincent Peale, the Trump family's minister and the author of The Power of Positive Thinking, a man whose entire theology was that if you present the successful version of yourself confidently enough, reality tends to fall in line. You could not design a more appropriate ceremony for this particular marriage if you tried. She was 13 weeks from her first pregnancy, and she had already signed away her claim on the fortune he hadn't built yet. The bride signed before she said the vows. That is the whole hierarchy of the next 13 years, visible on day one. And nobody in the photographs looks unhappy about it. Donald Jr. arrived at the end of 1977. Ivanka in 1981, Eric in 1984, and the agreement she'd signed did not stay signed. As the fortune grew, she went back and renegotiated in 1979, again in 1984, again in 1987. 4 versions in 10 years. In 1984, the cash figure rose to $2.5 million. By the end, the ceiling stood at $25 million, plus the Connecticut house. Every few years, the marriage got repriced. She always came out with more money and less ground, because each new signature confirmed the same principle. That whatever she built inside that company, her claim on it was whatever the last piece of paper said it was. Nobody outside the family saw any of this. What the public saw was the couple on magazine covers, the couple on Oprah, the couple on the BBC laughing with Dame Edna. New York's self-invented imperial couple, in Marie Brenner's phrase. Now go back to November 1979. Ivana flies to Prague with her 2-year-old son. Her parents meet her at the airport and drive her home to Zlin. It's a family visit. The grandparents will teach that boy fluent Czech over the coming years, and he'll keep it. Someone was taking notes. A file opened on that trip records that Ivana was no longer modeling and was now helping her husband in his business activities, designing interiors for Trump-financed buildings, and that the little boy had 2 nannies and a recently fractured leg. The note, typed up by a lieutenant named Joseph Knopp, said the agency would give her operational attention during her stay. The source was her father. Milos Zelnicek talked to the STB for years. That's not a rumor, and it's not an American political attack. It's in the Czechoslovak secret police files, declassified after the regime fell, and reported in 2016 and 2018 by The Guardian in partnership with the Czech weekly Respect. He was classified as a conspiratorial informer. The relationship lasted until communism collapsed. Before you decide what to do with that, hold 2 things at once. The Czech historian Tomáš Vilimek has pointed out that Zelnicek was an informant rather than an agent, and that men in his position were routinely squeezed, cooperate, or lose the travel privileges that let your daughter come home. He was a provincial engineer with a famous son-in-law and a state that noticed. There's no evidence Ivana knew what her father did with what she told him at the dinner table. But look at what she told him. In October 1988, she visited Zlin and mentioned, apparently in passing, that George H.W. Bush was going to win the American presidential election. Milos passed it on. Bush won. A file recorded that the outcome had confirmed the veracity of the information. That single accurate guess was worth more to Prague than a year of surveillance, because it proved she had a real line into the highest levels of American power. The directive that followed was to deepen the work. A report dated the 22nd of that same month is stranger still. It said Trump had been pressured to run for president in 1988, and declined because at 42 he thought himself too young, but that he intended to run in 1996 as an independent at 50. Even though it looks like a utopia, the report said, he is confident he will succeed. In the United States, essentially, nobody was taking that seriously yet. One more line from those files, and it's the one that should stop you. An informant wrote that any false step of hers would have incalculable consequences for the position of her husband, who intended to run for president. 2 intelligence services and 1 husband had all reached the same conclusion at roughly the same time. Ivana was an asset, and assets are managed. Inside the company, management looked like promotion. She was moved. Interior design, then Atlantic City, then the Plaza, each time upward on the org chart, and each time further from wherever he was. The castle job put her in New Jersey most of the week. She flew back and forth. Colleagues and biographers have described a marriage that ran on schedules, and by the late 80s, the schedules did most of the separating. Consider the shape of it. A couple who worked together constantly and were almost never in the same building. She was not a decoration, and she was not a partner. She was a division head, and the chairman was her husband, and there was no appeals process. When he wanted her closer to Manhattan, she came back to Manhattan and got the Plaza, and the $1 a year line. When he stopped wanting her anywhere at all, he had a straightforward way to communicate that. By the summer of 1989, he was seeing Marla Maples, a 25-year-old actress and model from Georgia. This is the part everybody knows, and it's the part I'm least interested in, because a rich man having an affair in 1989 is not news. What matters is where he had it. Maples was around the same events, the same restaurants, the same social circuit. She spent time aboard the Trump Princess, the yacht. The affair was conducted inside the world. Ivana ran in front of people Ivana had to keep working with, which meant a growing number of New Yorkers knew something she was not being told. Maples has since said she never thought of herself as a mistress, that she prayed every step of the way, that she wishes it had happened after the papers were signed. Take that for what it's worth, a participant's recollection, given decades later. It doesn't change the geography. The geography is the humiliation. Then Aspen, at the end of December 1989. The family was there for Christmas. Trump had arranged for Maples to be in Aspen at the same time. The 2 women encountered each other in public, on the mountain, in front of other people. Accounts of exactly what was said vary depending on who was telling it and when, so I'm not going to reconstruct dialogue that nobody wrote down. Here's what isn't disputed. The wife and the mistress were put in the same room by the husband, on a family holiday, with witnesses. That's the thing about the story that gets lost when it's retold as tabloid comedy. He didn't get caught. He arranged it. Ivana understood immediately what had changed. Not that he'd been unfaithful. She was 13 years into a marriage in that city, and she was not naive. What changed was that it was no longer private, which meant it was no longer manageable, which which meant the terms of her employment had shifted without notice. She didn't file first. She made a phone call. Liz Smith was the most read gossip columnist in the country, working for the New York Daily News. And she knew the Trumps socially. They had taken her on trips. Ivana asked her to come to the plaza. Smith went. On February 11, 1990, the Daily News told the world that Donald and Ivana Trump were finished, and the story was framed exactly the way Ivana needed it framed. The wife and business partner, discarded for a younger woman. For 11 consecutive days, it ran on the front pages. Smith later said it was the biggest story she ever covered that amounted to a hill of beans, two rich people arguing about money, and that she came to regret becoming a character in it. Trump reportedly threatened to buy the Daily News for the sole purpose of firing her. He couldn't. So he retaliated with the only instruments he had. By that February, according to the Chicago Tribune, he had locked her out of her office at the plaza. Sit with that image for a second. The hotel she had spent a year and a half restoring, the lemon wedges and the carpets and the staff dress code, the job she'd taken for $1 and a public joke, and the locks changed while the newspapers were still calling her the woman who ran the plaza. The counterattack ran through the New York Post, where Cindy Adams was a friend of Donald's. On February 13, the Post's front page mocked Ivana's financial demands. On February 16 came the headline that outlived everyone involved. A claim, attributed to Maples through a supposed friend, about Trump's performance in bed. Maples has denied ever saying it. A Post editor at the time reportedly approved the story on the theory that this was one Donald would never sue over. So the marriage ended the way it had been conducted, as a media campaign, with columnists as surrogates and headlines as artillery. The difference is that Ivana fired first, and Ivana was better at it. She had spent a decade watching him build a personality out of press coverage. She'd taken notes. And it did her almost no good at all, because the paperwork was still the paperwork. Her lawyers went after the prenuptial agreements, all 4 of them, arguing she was entitled to a share of what she'd helped build. Reports at the time put her claims in the range of $150 to $500 million. Her spokesman said she sought only a fair settlement of the fortune she and her husband had built for their family. Her timing was catastrophic. Trump in 1990 was at what he later called the lowest financial point of his life, so overextended that the banks were negotiating with him rather than foreclosing on him. There was no clean pile of money to divide, and the agreements she had signed in 1977, 1979, 1984, and 1987 said what they said. In October 1990, with the divorce still unresolved, Milos Zelnicek died suddenly of a heart attack in Czechoslovakia. He was 63. The funeral was held in Zlín the following month. Donald Trump went with her and stood at her side. I want to be careful here because this is the moment the story could turn sentimental and it shouldn't. There is no evidence this was a reconciliation. They were in open legal war and the tabloids were still running daily. He got on a plane to a country he had no reason to visit, for a man who had spent years reporting on him to the secret police, though there's no indication Trump knew that, and he stood beside his wife in front of her mother and her town, while the American press was calling her every name available. 2 things were true, simultaneously, and the surviving record doesn't let us collapse them into one. He humiliated her publicly and systematically for the better part of a year. He also showed up in Zlín in November. People who have never been in a long marriage find that contradictory. People who have, don't. The trip changed nothing legal. The divorce was granted on December 12, 1990, on the grounds of cruel and inhumane treatment by Donald. That phrase is not a tabloid flourish. It's the legal ground on which a New York judge dissolved the marriage, and it went in uncontested. The money took 3 more months. In March 1991, the New York Times reported the terms: $14 million, the 45-room house in Connecticut, an apartment at Trump Plaza, $650,000 a year for the children, and the use of Mar-a-Lago for 1 month a year. She had asked for a share of the empire and received a visitor's pass to it. But the number was never the real cost of that settlement. Buried in the agreement was a clause about what she was allowed to say, and about who had to approve it before she said it. She signed a confidentiality agreement as a condition of the settlement. Under it, she was required to seek his permission before discussing their marriage publicly. She tried, later, to have that portion struck. He refused. In 1992, an appellate court ruled it enforceable. So the woman who had just won the biggest tabloid war in New York history walked out of the marriage, legally forbidden to describe it, without the approval of the man she'd won it against. She tested the fence almost immediately. She sat down with Barbara Walters for 2020. In May 1991, Trump cut off her alimony payments over that interview and announced he'd sue her for damages. That's the enforcement mechanism, and it's worth naming plainly. Her income was contingent on her silence, and the silence was defined by him. She went back to Oprah in 1992 anyway, and said she would not let men dominate her anymore. Then she did something smarter than defiance. She stopped fighting for the right to tell the true story and started building a business out of the public one. Look at what she sold for the next 20 years. Clothing, fashion jewelry, and beauty products on the Home Shopping Network and on QVC in London. A fragrance company on Park Avenue. Novels. For Love Alone in 1992, Free to Love in 1993, thinly veiled fiction about a European woman who marries an American tycoon, which is how you narrate a marriage you're contractually barred from narrating. A divorce manual in 1995 called The Best Is Yet to Come. An advice column in the supermarket tabloid Globe, running from 1995 to 2010. 15 years of telling other women what to do about their husbands. And in 1996, a cameo in the First Wives Club, delivering the line she is still quoted saying, "Ladies, you have to be strong and independent, and remember, don't get mad, get everything." She had gotten $14 million out of a man worth over $1 billion on paper. She had not gotten everything. She had gotten a brand, which in that family was arguably the more valuable asset, and she had built it out of the exact humiliation he'd inflicted on her. The Czech girl who invented an Olympic career in 1988 was now selling the story of the wronged first wife. And this time the story was true and it belonged to her. She married twice more. The Italian businessman Riccardo Mazzucchelli in 1995, divorced by 1997, and when that ended she sued him for $15 million for violating the confidentiality clause in their prenuptial agreement. Read that again. She had become the person enforcing the GAGI. The fourth wedding, in April 2008, is the one that explains what the marriage had actually turned into. She married the Italian actor Rossano Rubicondi, 23 years younger, in front of 400 guests at Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump hosted it. His sister, the federal judge Marianne Trump Barry, officiated. Ivanka was maid of honor. Her ex-husband threw her a $3 million wedding to another man at his own house. That is not friendship, and it isn't forgiveness. It's a family corporation holding an annual meeting. 3 children, 10 eventual grandchildren, a shared name that was now a licensed product. The romance had been dead for 18 years, and the enterprise was thriving. The politics arrived and the arrangement held. In 2015, the Daily Beast's Tim Mack revisited an account from Harry Hurt's 1993 book Lost Tycoon, which drew on Ivana's divorce deposition. "Here is the record as it exists," stated carefully, "because it deserves care." In a deposition during the divorce, Ivana used the word rape to describe an incident in 1989. When Hurt's book was going to press, she provided a statement, obtained through Donald and his lawyers, confirming she had used that word, saying she felt violated because the tenderness he normally showed her was absent, but that she did not want it interpreted in a literal or criminal sense. In 2015, she went further, calling the story totally without merit, saying they were the best of friends, and adding that she thought he'd make an incredible president. Every one of those later statements was made by a woman under a court-enforced agreement requiring his permission to speak about their marriage. That doesn't tell you what happened in 1989. It tells you why the record can't settle it, and historians remain divided for exactly that reason. What is not divided is what Trump's lawyer Michael Cohen said to the reporter, that by definition you cannot rape your spouse, which was false in New York and had been since 1984, alongside a threat to take him for every penny he didn't have. Cohen apologized for the remark days later. When Trump won in 2016, he offered her the ambassadorship to the Czech Republic. She turned it down. The girl who needed a fake marriage to get an Austrian passport was offered her country back as a gift, with a title, and said no. Her memoir came the next year. Raising Trump, 2017. Notice what it's about. Not the marriage. The children. She wrote the one book she was permitted to write, about the one asset the settlement couldn't restrict, and she used it to claim the thing that mattered most to her, that whatever else the family was, those 3 were hers. She died on July 14, 2022, at 73, from blunt impact injuries after a fall at her home on the Upper East Side. The medical examiner ruled it an accident. Her funeral was at the Church of St. Vincent Ferrer, a few blocks away. She left an estate of $34 million, split among Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, with bequests to a close friend and to Dorothy Curry, the family's former nanny, a woman who had raised her children alongside her. Remembered in the will, while the man she'd been married to for 13 years received nothing. Then they buried her beside the first fairway at Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, under a small stone not far from the clubhouse. The internet decided within a week that it was a tax scheme. New Jersey exempts cemetery companies from property, sales, income, business, and inheritance tax, and a Dartmouth professor called the arrangement a trifecta of tax avoidance. It made a satisfying story. It's also, as far as the actual record goes, wrong. Tax specialists reviewing the statute concluded the golf club does not qualify as a cemetery company and receives no such exemption. The truth is worse, and it's a matter of public record. In 2014, the Trump Family Trust applied to the New Jersey State Cemetery Board for authority to operate a private 10-plot cemetery on a small parcel of that golf course for Donald Trump and members of his family. The board granted Certificate of Authority number 434 on February 4th, 2016. The plot was approved 6 years before she died. It was never built for her. It was built for him, on his favorite property. And she is the first person in it, the sole occupant, so far, of a family plot filed for by a trust she was not part of, on land she did not own under a document she never signed. Now go back to that couch in 1988. He says she does exactly as he tells her. She laughs, because in that room, at that moment, it plays as a joke between two people who are winning. She spent the next 34 years disproving it in the only currency available to her. She broke the story of her own divorce before he could. She turned the wronged wife into a product line and sold it on 2 continents. She wrote novels around a gag order and enforced an identical gag order on her own third husband. She refused an ambassadorship from a sitting president. She wrote a book about the children and left the nanny a $1 million apartment and left him nothing. And every one of those moves was made inside a structure someone else had drafted, a passport marriage in Prague, 4 prenuptial agreements between 1977 and 1987, a confidentiality clause a court upheld in 1992, and a cemetery certificate issued in 2016. She got out of Czechoslovakia with a marriage certificate. She got out of the Trump marriage with a settlement that told her what she could say. She never got out of the paperwork. The scandal was never the affair, or the headlines, or the deposition everyone still argues about. The scandal is that a woman that formidable spent her whole life signing her way toward freedom, and the last document with her name on it was filed by somebody else. February 1990. 2 New York tabloids ran the same divorce on their front pages for 11 straight days. America thought it was watching a marriage explode. It wasn't. That marriage had been a contract since March 1977, when Ivana sat down to negotiate a prenup drafted by Roy Cohn. In 1988, her husband called a press conference, named her president of the Plaza, and joked he'd pay her $1 a year. She phoned friends in tears. 3 years later, she signed something worse and spent the next 30 years finding ways around it. It began at a restaurant table. She was 27, in New York for a few days with a group of models sent to promote the Montreal Olympics, and the restaurant was full. In the version she told the New York Post decades later, a tall blonde man offered to get them seated. He did. He paid. He drove them back to the hotel afterward. She noticed, she said, that the good news and the bad news were the same fact. The table came with him attached. That's a charming story, and it's the one she repeated for 40 years, which is worth noticing on its own. Ivana was good at anecdotes. She sanded them down until they fit in an interview. What the anecdote leaves out is that she had already spent 6 years engineering her way across borders using documents, and that she was very, very good at it. Go back to where she came from. She was born Ivana Marie Zelníková in 1949 in a Czechoslovak factory town that the communists had just renamed Gottwaldov. It is Zelin again now. Her father was an electrical engineer, her mother a telephone operator. She started skiing at 4 and made the junior national team, which mattered less for the medals than for the passport stamps. Team travel was one of the few legal ways a young Czech could see the other side of the wall and come back. Her mother later said, plainly, that the girl did not want to stay. There is a story attached to that period that got repeated for decades, that Ivana had been an alternate on the Czechoslovak Olympic ski team. It circulated in profiles all through the 80s. It is not true. Czechoslovakia did not send a single female alpine skier to the 1972 Winter Games. And in 1989, the Secretary General of the Czechoslovak Olympic Committee, Petr Pomezny, said he had searched and found no record of her involvement at all. Snopes confirmed the Olympic roster point in 2021. Keep that in mind because the pattern it establishes matters more than the lie itself, Ivana understood early that the paperwork version of your life and the true version of your life are two different documents, and that the paperwork version is the one people act on. In 1971, she married a man named Alfred Winkelmeyer. He was an Austrian ski instructor and, by her own account and everyone else's, a friend. Nothing more. She later called it a Cold War marriage and said it was never consummated. What it produced was an Austrian passport, issued in March 1972, which let her leave Czechoslovakia without defecting, meaning she could still go home and see her parents. In 1973, she got an absentee divorce in Los Angeles, where Winkelmeyer had moved to teach skiing. Think about what she had just done at 22. She had used a wedding as an exit visa. She landed in Montreal, where she lived with George Siravatka, a Czech skier she had dated since 1967 who had defected in 1971 and opened a ski boutique. She worked as a ski instructor and modeled for a Canadian agency. And here is a detail that gets skipped. During those years, she told people she was married to Siravatka. She was not. They never wed. So by the time she walked into that Manhattan restaurant, she had held one marriage she did not want and claimed a second one that did not exist. Marriage, for Ivana, had never once been a romantic institution. It was infrastructure. There was real loss underneath the maneuvering. Before Canada, she had been involved with Jiří Stadl, a well-known Prague lyricist, who was killed in a car crash in 1973. Years later, in the middle of the Trump divorce, she told Ladies' Home Journal that before all of this she had known exactly one tragedy in her life. She meant Stadl. That is the only window we get, and it is a small one. She did not hand out many. The paperwork caught up with her, briefly, in 1989. FBI files released decades later show the Bureau reviewing her immigration record, while New Jersey gaming regulators were looking at the Trump casinos. An October 1989 document described her Immigration and Naturalization Service file as fraught with inconsistencies about dates of residence, schooling, and employment. Agents noted that she had told the New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement she studied at Charles University until 1973 that there was no mention anywhere in the file of time spent in Austria and no other indication she had attended Charles University at all. The Bureau later confirmed she had in fact earned a master's in physical education there in 1972. So the degree was real. The timeline was not. That is the shape of almost everything about her early life, a true thing presented in a shape that served the moment. Now put her across the table from Donald Trump in 1976. He was 30, still living largely inside his father's orbit, and he had just started chasing the deal that would make him the ruined Commodore Hotel next to Grand Central, which became the Grand Hyatt. He was not yet famous. He was a Queens developer with an outer borough name trying to get taken seriously in Manhattan. What did each of them see? She saw a country. She saw a man with money and a construction empire under him, and a route into New York that didn't run through a ski boutique in Montreal. He saw something New York couldn't manufacture, a European woman with an accent, an athletic resume, real design instincts, and an appetite for work. She wasn't decoration. She could run things, and within a few years she would be running very large things. That combination, a wife who upgraded the image and also did the labor, was, from his side, an extremely good acquisition. 9 months after the restaurant, they were getting married. In March 1977, before the wedding, she sat down for the first time to negotiate a prenuptial agreement. The lawyer across from her was Roy Cohn. If you don't know the name, Cohn had been Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel, and by the 70s he was Trump's attorney, fixer, and most important mentor. His clients included Fat Tony Salerno and John Gotti. He also, on the side, did family law, and his written advice on prenups was about as romantic as you'd expect. Plan now for the day the relationship goes down the drain. According to reporting later published by the New York Times, the agreement stipulated that if the couple split, Ivana would return everything he had given her during the marriage. The cars, the furs, the rings. Not a division of assets, a return of inventory. She was stunned. Trump's response, according to the same accounts, was to blame the lawyer. That's a small moment and it does a lot of work. The terms were his, the villain was assigned to Cohn, and the deal stood. She signed, then she signed again, and again. Over the years, the couple negotiated 4 successive prenuptial agreements, each one revisiting the price of her exit. Here's the detail that will pay off in 13 years, so hold on to it. Ivana's lawyer during that first negotiation had professional and personal ties to Trump's own circle. In 1977, that looked like convenience. In 1990, her divorce attorneys would use it as a crowbar, arguing she had never been properly represented at all. They married in April 1977 at Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue. Sources give the date as either the 7th or the 9th, and the family's own accounts have never fully agreed. The officiant was Norman Vincent Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking, and the Trump family's pastor, which is almost too neat. The man who taught America that you can think your way into a better reality presided over the union of 2 people who had each already rewritten their own biography once. Her father, Milos Zelnicek, flew in from Zlin for it. On that trip, his belongings were searched at the airport on the orders of an officer of the STB, Czechoslovakia's state security service. Researchers at the Prague-based Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, working from files in the Czech Security Services archive, have described the search as a signal rather than an investigation. The message was that permission to visit his daughter in America was conditional. That same year, Zelnicek began cooperating. The STB opened a long-running operation on the couple. Its code name was her first name. So the wedding produced 2 records. One was the marriage license. The other was a 2-page report filed by a secret police collaborator in a country she'd married a stranger to escape. She had used 1 marriage to get out. She had just signed into another that would take 13 years and 4 contracts to get out of. And the man she'd married was about to discover that his new wife was better at business than almost anyone he employed, which turned out to be the most dangerous thing about her. The work started immediately, and it was not ceremonial. She took on the interiors of the Grand Hyatt, the hotel that turned a Queens developer into a Manhattan name. Then Trump Tower, where the pink marble atrium and the brass and the whole gilded vocabulary of 80s New York got built partly to her specifications. She was made vice president of interior design for the Trump Organization. Then, in the mid-80s, she was sent to Atlantic City to run Trump's castle as president. 4,000 employees, a casino floor, payroll, comps, marketing, the whole machine. People who knew the operation have said flatly that he would not have gotten as far as he did without her. And while that's the kind of thing friends say after someone dies, in her case there's a paper trail of actual responsibility behind it. She was not a wife who attended luncheons. She was a wife who ran a casino, and then went home to 3 children. Donald Jr. arrived in 1977, Ivanka in 1981, Eric in 1984. And here the marriage produced one of its stranger arrangements, one that says a lot about who Ivana actually was. She spoke Czech to her children. She sent them back to Zlin in the summers to stay with her parents, in an apartment in a communist factory town, with no staff and no yacht. Don Jr. came out of those summers fluent. Ivanka picked up fragments. Eric, born last after her parents' circumstances changed, never got it at all. We know about those summers with unusual precision, and the reason is uncomfortable. We know because the STB wrote them down. Her father's cooperation, which had started with a searched suitcase in 1977, became routine. Files studied by the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes and reported by Czech television, and separately by The Guardian and the Czech magazine Respect, show Milos Zelnicek classified as a conspiratorial informer, feeding the local office reports on his daughter's life in America and his son-in-law's business. His phone calls with her were tapped. His mail was read. The relationship lasted until the regime itself ended. The Czech historian Petr Blazek, who worked on the files, has been careful about what this means. Zelnicek passed along material the service could get elsewhere anyway. There's no sign he handed over anything compromising. He was a mechanic and an amateur sports coach who wanted to be allowed to see his grandchildren. And the price of the airport gate was a conversation with a man from the ministry every so often. That is not espionage. That is a father being taxed. It did produce one document worth stopping on. On the 22nd of October, 1988, an STB report recorded that Donald Trump had declined pressure to run for president that year because at 42 he considered himself too young, but that he intended to run in 1996 as an independent and was confident he would win. The report allows that this looks like fantasy. The source was, ultimately, Ivana talking to her father about her husband's ambitions during a visit home. In the United States in 1988, the public had almost nothing on this. There was an Oprah appearance where he said he wouldn't rule it out and thought he'd win if he tried. That was it. The fuller version, the year, the strategy, the certainty, sat in a filing cabinet in Prague because his wife told her dad. That's the marriage at its peak, and I want you to see both halves of it at once. Publicly, the Trump princess docked on the East River for the 4th of July, 1988. Ivana sworn in as an American citizen that May, the two of them photographed on the courthouse steps. Palm Beach balls, Adolfo suits, a couple who seemed to be competing with royalty and enjoying it. Privately, a woman commuting to a casino, teaching her kids a language from behind the Iron Curtain, and unknowingly relaying her husband's political timeline to a security service through her own father. Then came 1988 and the Plaza Hotel, and the moment the whole thing turned. Trump bought the Plaza that year for around $400 million, which even sympathetic accounts described as far too much. He announced that Ivana would be its president. He did it at a press conference. According to Marie Brenner, who reported the definitive contemporary account for Vanity Fair in September 1990, he told the room that his wife was a brilliant manager and that he'd pay her $1 a year and all the dresses she could buy. Read the joke again. $1 a year and dresses, delivered to reporters about the woman who had just spent years running his Atlantic City property. Brenner reported that Ivana called friends afterward in tears, asking how he could humiliate her that way. Everyone treated it as a promotion. It was the opposite. Ivana had argued against Atlantic City from the start, on the unglamorous grounds that the place had no airport. She lost that argument, and then went down there and made the property work anyway. By 1988, though, Atlantic City had a new feature, Marla Maples. Brenner's reporting describes the affair as underway well before Ivana knew of it, and some later accounts date it to 1985, which should be treated as an estimate rather than a fact, since the people best positioned to know all had reasons to shade the calendar. What isn't in dispute is the geography problem. His wife was running a casino in the same small city where his girlfriend was staying. Brenner reported the ultimatum he put to Ivana: come back to New York and be his wife and mother to his children, or take the hotel. The Plaza was the elegant version of a transfer order. A friend told Brenner he had become so fixed on Maples that he was neglecting the business, which, given what happened to that business in 1990, is not a small observation. So she took the Plaza in New York at a nominal salary, 120 miles from where her husband's actual life was happening. She had been promoted out of the room. She did not find out for another year and a half. Her own account, in her 2017 memoir, is that she knew the marriage was over after a day in December 1989, in Aspen, when a young blonde woman she didn't recognize came up to her and announced that she loved Ivana's husband, and asked whether Ivana did. She wrote that she told the woman to get lost, that she loved her husband, and that it was unladylike, but she was in shock. That's the version America knows. It's worth noting she told it differently in 1991, to Barbara Walters, where she described approaching a friend of Maples's to ask whether the rumor was true, and not realizing Maples herself was standing right there. Same day, same ski slope, two arrangements of who spoke first. Biographers have also reported that Trump had arranged for Maples to be in Aspen while his family was there. Whatever the precise choreography, the outcome is fixed. The wife found out on a public mountain, in front of people, on a family holiday. She confronted him. According to the account she gave later, she gave him a choice, and he chose Maples. What happened over the next 8 weeks is one of the great demonstrations of a woman with no legal leverage using the only instrument available to her. In early February 1990, just before flying to Tokyo for the Tyson versus Douglas fight, Trump told her he was leaving. His own hired spokesman characterized it to reporters as things simply not working out. On February 11th, the Daily News ran Liz Smith's column reporting that the marriage was finished. He came back from Japan to a banner headline. Smith was not a neutral party, and never pretended to be. She knew the couple socially. Ivana asked her to come to the Plaza. The news coverage that followed was unmistakably on Ivana's side. The loyal wife, the working partner, the woman who helped build the empire, and was now being discarded for a younger woman. The paper ran Trump material on the front page for 11 consecutive days. Newsweek put them on the cover on the 26th under the headline, "The War of the Trumps," and noted that the pro-Ivana framing had a purpose, which became obvious the moment Trump's side leaked the existence of the prenuptial agreement. She had also, by then, hired the divorce attorney, Michael Kennedy, and a professional public relations man named John Scanlon. That is not the behavior of a woman in shock. That is a campaign staff. Trump lost the press war badly enough that he told people he would buy the Daily News simply to fire Liz Smith. Instead, his side went to the Post. On February 16th, the Post ran the front page that outlived everyone involved, a photograph of a delighted Donald Trump and a headline quoting Marla Maples on his sexual performance. Maples has denied ever saying it. Jill Brooke, then a Post columnist, wrote in 2018 that the paper's editors ran it because they were certain of one thing. This was the story Donald would never sue over. The Post's managing editor was right, but the page didn't do what it was supposed to. It made the husband look like a man delighted to be discussed, and it made the wife look like the only adult in the marriage. Meanwhile, he was telling the Post he liked Ivana, but they'd grown apart, that her arrogance had worsened, and that he didn't want to create another Leona Helmsley, the New York hotel operator, then, on her way to federal prison for tax evasion, universally caricatured as a monstrous woman. He compared his wife of 13 years, publicly, to the most hated woman in New York, and in the same breath called their prenuptial agreement airtight, fair, and modern. He was about to find out how airtight it actually was, and the flaw wasn't in the money. It was in a decision made in March 1977, before either of them knew what the marriage would be worth. The 1977 agreement had been negotiated by a woman with a lawyer who was close to her fiancé's world. That was the crack. Kennedy's team went at the prenups on the grounds that Ivana had never had genuinely independent representation when the first one was signed, and that everything built on top of it inherited the defect. Trump had called the agreement airtight in the papers. It was not. Her lawyers also put on the record what the marriage had been like in its final stretch. In a filing reviewed years later by the Daily Beast, they wrote that over the 3 years preceding the divorce, he had increasingly verbally abused and demeaned her in order to obtain her submission to his wishes, and that he had humiliated and verbally assaulted her. That's not a memoir written for money in 2017. That's a contemporaneous court document, filed while both parties were fighting. Then, in the middle of it, her father died. Milos Zelnicek had a heart attack in October 1990. He was 63. The funeral was held in Zlin in November, and Donald Trump flew to Czechoslovakia and stood next to his soon-to-be ex-wife through it, in front of her mother, her country, and the cameras. I don't think that was cynical. I think that's what makes it hard. He showed up for the worst week of her life while their attorneys were still billing hours against each other, and there is no evidence it softened a single term of the settlement. Both things are true. The marriage had reached a point where genuine decency could occur and change nothing about the arithmetic. Something else was ending that month. The man who had been feeding reports to the STB for 13 years took his file with him, and the regime that ran it had collapsed the year before. Whatever Zelnicek had done to keep his visa, it was over, and nobody in New York knew it had happened at all. The uncontested divorce was granted in December 1990 on grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment by Donald Trump. He did not contest that characterization. It's in the judgment. Then, on March 22, 1991, they signed the settlement. And the settlement is where the marriage stopped being a marriage and became what it had always been underneath. She got $10 million in cash, payable within 90 days. $350,000 a year in maintenance. $300,000 a year in child support. The 45-room house in Greenwich, an apartment in the Trump Organization's New York building, use of the Palm Beach estate. Press reports put the total value around $25 million, though contemporary figures vary. The Post reported the cash portion as $14 million, other accounts as $10 million. The discrepancy was never fully resolved in public and probably never will be, because divorce records in New York are not open to inspection. What she also signed were paragraphs 9 and 10. Those paragraphs barred her from publishing, or causing to be published, any diary, memoir, letter, story, photograph, interview, article, essay, account, or description or depiction of any kind whatsoever. And here's the phrase that matters, whether fictionalized or not, concerning her marriage to Donald, or any other aspect of his personal, business, or financial affairs. Whether fictionalized or not, Somebody drafting that clause anticipated the novel before she wrote it. Breach it, and the payments stopped, and the benefits terminated, and he could seek an injunction to shut her up. She tried almost immediately to get free of it. In May 1991, Judge Phyllis Gangle Jacob set the 2 paragraphs aside on First Amendment grounds after her attorney argued they abridged her constitutional rights. Trump's lawyer immediately announced that this changed nothing about her contractual liability. He was right. In April 1992, the Appellate Division held the confidentiality provision enforceable and said the lower court had excluded it from the judgment without notice or explanation. In June, the same court unanimously reaffirmed it and cleared him to sue her. In October, New York's highest court declined to hear her appeal. So the record is this: a judge granted her a divorce because of his cruelty, and then the courts of the same state confirmed that she had traded the right to describe it. She got the money. He got the silence. And America went on believing it had watched the whole thing happen on the front page, when the actual terms of that marriage were sitting in a sealed file with 2 paragraphs in the middle of it that nobody read. Now watch what she did with a gag order. In 1992, she published a novel called For Love Alone. It concerned a beautiful European woman who marries a rich, ruthless American and is betrayed by him. In 1993, she published a second one, Free to Love. Her lawyer, Floyd Abrams, one of the most prominent First Amendment litigators in the country, which tells you she was not improvising, said the obvious thing: it is a novel. It is not about Mr. Trump. Trump sued her for $25 million, arguing that the novel was the marriage with the names changed, and that publishing it voided the settlement. When the appellate court cleared him to proceed, he called it a great victory for everyone who believes in the sanctity of contracts, which is a remarkable sentence from a man who had just been divorced for cruelty and was, at that moment, also suing to end her alimony on the theory that she was living with an Italian businessman. That's the woman she had become by 43. Barred from telling the story, she sold it as fiction, hired the country's best free speech lawyer, and made him litigate the difference. The suit dragged and went nowhere near a verdict. And then she did something more effective than any lawsuit. She became likable. The QVC lines, the jewelry, the clothes, the beauty products, sold on cable to women who had watched her get humiliated in the tabloids and decided she was one of them. The advice column in Globe, Ask Ivana, which she wrote from 1995 to 2010, 15 years of a woman who was legally forbidden to discuss her own divorce, dispensing advice to other people about theirs. A New York gossip columnist put the appeal plainly. Women related to her because she had suffered, and America loves someone who gets beaten down and comes back. She bought a yacht, she went back on the runway at 52, and she distilled the whole decade into a line she repeated for the rest of her life: don't get mad, get everything. Look at what that line actually is. It's the moral of a story she was under contract not to tell, compressed into 6 words that no court could touch. Then, in 1995, she married the Italian entrepreneur Riccardo Mazzucchelli, and when it fell apart 2 years later, she sued him for $15 million for violating the confidentiality clause in their prenuptial agreement. She had been gagged, so she started gagging people. The rest of it can be told quickly, because the pattern doesn't change, it just gets more comfortable. In April 2008, she married her 4th husband at Mar-a-Lago, and Donald Trump hosted the wedding. The ex-wife who had sued him and been sued by him got married in his ballroom. In 2015, as he ran for president, a reporter for the Daily Beast went back to Harry Hurt III's 1993 biography, Lost Tycoon, which quoted her sealed 1990 deposition, in which she had used the word rape to describe an incident in 1989. Handle this carefully, because the record demands it. Trump has always denied it. When Hurt III's book was going to press, Trump and his lawyers produced a statement from Ivana that was printed on the first page of the book, in which she confirmed she had said it in the deposition, said she had felt violated, and said she did not want her words interpreted in a literal or criminal sense. In 2015, she went further and called the story totally without merit. Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, defending him, told the reporter that a man cannot rape his spouse, then apologized and called his own comment inarticulate. And every one of Ivana's later statements was made by a woman who, since March 1991, could not legally discuss her marriage without his permission, and would lose her settlement if she did. That doesn't tell you what happened in 1989. It tells you why nothing she said afterward can be read as if she were free. In October 2017, she published Raising Trump, a memoir about her children that was warm about the marriage and unforgiving about Marla Maples, whom she accused of participating in her humiliation. Notice what got published and what didn't. The book was about motherhood. Motherhood wasn't in paragraph 9. On Good Morning America, promoting it, she joked that she had the direct number to the White House but didn't use it, because she didn't want to make Melania jealous. She was, after all, the First Lady. First Lady? Okay. Melania's office responded the same day, through her spokeswoman Stephanie Grisham, that there was clearly no substance to the statement, that it was attention-seeking and self-serving noise, and that the actual First Lady planned to use her title to help children, not sell books. Ivana had made a joke on morning television and drawn return fire from the East Wing. At 68, with a gag order still on her, she could move a White House with one sentence. She died at her Manhattan townhouse on July 14, 2022, at 73, of injuries from a fall. She left an estate of about $34 million, most of it split among Don Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, with bequests to a close friend and to Dorothy Curry, the family's former nanny, the woman who had helped raise the children while their mother ran a casino. She was buried at Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, in a simple grave near the first tee, on grounds the club had registered as a cemetery. Go back to that press conference in 1988. He stands up in front of reporters, names his wife president of the Plaza, and gets a laugh with the line about $1 a year and all the dresses she can buy. It plays as affection. It was a demotion delivered as a compliment, and she went home and cried on the phone about it, and then went and ran the hotel anyway, because that was the arrangement. He could take the Plaza back. He took it back within 18 months, and had her locked out of her own office there in February 1990. The grave is not a title. There is no clause in it. The woman he paid $1 a year, the one he made sign 4 contracts, and then a 5th that forbade her from saying what any of it was like, is the only one of his wives who is never leaving his property. February 16th, 1990. The New York Post puts 6 words on its front page, and America decides it knows exactly who Marla Maples is. Best sex I've ever had. She says she never said it. 28 years later, she told a reporter someone else did. By then, she'd signed a document handed to her 5 days before her wedding. $1 million, a confidentiality clause, and a 5-year clock. He separated from her in month 41. She has never told her side. She still can't. And she's the only one who knows it. It begins on a ski slope. But hold on the headline for a second, because that front page is doing more work than anyone gave it credit for at the time. The words appeared under a photograph of Donald Trump. The full deck read that Marla was boasting to her pals about Donald. Not an interview, not a statement. A boast, secondhand attributed to a 26-year-old actress from North Georgia who had not yet given a single on-the-record interview about him. Trump was still married to Ivana. The divorce was 3 weeks into becoming the loudest tabloid story in New York, and this was the moment Marla Maples stopped being a name in a gossip column and became a punchline with a face. In 2018, reporting for jury duty in Manhattan, she was asked about it directly by Page 6. Her answer was flat and unambiguous. She never said that. Someone else said that. Then she added something stranger and more interesting, which we'll come back to. There is one other account of where those words came from, and it needs a warning label. Jill Brooke, a former Post journalist, wrote in 2018 that she had been in the room during a phone call in which Trump was pitching the paper's editor, Jerry Nachman, on a front page. That Nachman explained a cover requires murder, money, or sex, and that Trump immediately supplied the line himself, then called across the room for Marla to confirm it. Brooke says she heard a faint yes in the background. That recollection surfaced 28 years after the fact, from a single witness in a guest column. Treat it as what it is, one person's memory, not a document. What's not in dispute is the reaction inside Trump's own company. Barbara Rez, who ran construction for him and had no reason to invent a flattering story about the Post, later recalled that the executives thought the headline was awful, worried about the children who could read newspapers, and that he thought it was terrific. So the first sentence the American public ever heard from Marla Maples may not have been hers, and the man it flattered may have been the one who moved it. Keep that structure in mind. It repeats. She was not a starlet who wandered into this. She was a very specific kind of American product. Marla Ann Maples was born in October 1963 in Cohutta, Georgia, a town so small it barely qualifies as one. Her mother, Ann, had modeled. Her father, Stanley Edward Maples, was a real estate developer, a county commissioner, and a songwriter. And a 1990 Vanity Fair profile described him as a deacon in the Baptist church. Add that up. She grew up in a house where the family business was selling property, the family reputation was maintained in public office, the family faith was performed in front of a congregation every Sunday, and her father wrote songs. She was homecoming queen at Northwest Whitfield High in Tunnel Hill in her senior year. Class secretary, basketball. She went to the University of Georgia, then came north. Her first real film credit in 1986 was a part in Stephen King's Maximum Overdrive, where she is credited essentially as a woman who screams. None of that is destiny, but it means she arrived in New York already fluent in something most aspiring actresses were not: the difference between what a family is and what a family looks like from the pew. She understood staging before she understood Manhattan. There's one more detail from these years, and it comes from later reporting rather than from her. So hold it loosely. In Confidence Man, Maggie Haberman writes that Maples traveled with a wedding dress so that if Trump ever decided the moment had arrived, she'd be ready. It's a secondhand image of a woman waiting on another person's timing. File it. It pays off in a way nobody intended. Now Aspen. Over Christmas of 1989, the Trumps were skiing in Colorado, and so was Marla. That was not a coincidence, and it had not been one for some time. Exactly how long the relationship had been running is genuinely unsettled. Accounts have placed the first contact anywhere from the mid-1980s to 1989, and the people best positioned to know have every incentive to shade the date in different directions. What's solid is what happened on the mountain. Ivana confronted her. Ivana's own version, published in her 2017 memoir, has the encounter happening in front of her children at lunch. She's an interested witness writing nearly 3 decades later, but the collision itself was reported at the time and never seriously denied by anyone. Liz Smith broke the marriage story in New York, and from there it stopped being a private matter and became a circulation event. The tabloids ran it for months. Trump's daughter Ivanka later wrote that a reporter asked her, as a small child, whether Marla's claims were true. Here's the part the standard telling gets backwards. Marla Maples is usually described as a nobody who got famous by accident, dragged into the spotlight by a scandal she couldn't control. Look at what actually happened to her visibility over the next 24 months and ask who was steering. She was on the cover of newspapers she'd never spoken to. She was on television constantly. In 1991, she turned up at WrestleMania as a celebrity timekeeper and played herself on Designing Women. That's not the trajectory of someone hiding. That's the trajectory of someone being deployed. And the timing matters, because 1990 was the worst year of Donald Trump's professional life. The Taj Mahal opened in Atlantic City in April 1990 and started failing almost immediately. Within 2 years, he'd been through casino bankruptcies, surrendered the Trump shuttle, given up his yacht, and lost his stake in the Plaza Hotel. His bankers put him on a personal allowance. The man who spent the decade selling himself as the most successful person in America was, in a technical sense, insolvent, and the only asset that hadn't lost value was his name in the papers. He got married to Ivana in a business, and the split cost him roughly $14 million, plus the Connecticut estate and $650,000 a year in child support. Remember that number. It explains almost everything about what came next. They got engaged in 1991. He gave her a 7.45-carat emerald-cut diamond from Harry Winston. That ring is going to come back, and when it does, it will not be romantic. Then nothing happened. For 2 years. They broke up and reconciled and broke up again, in public, with the tabloids keeping score. She took the only significant independent job of her adult life in August 1992, joining the Broadway cast of the Will Rogers Follies as Ziegfeld's favorite. He talked her up to the Washington Post before she went on, saying he thought she'd be great, and that it took guts. That sounds supportive. Hold it against something he said on national television 18 months later, and it curdles. What broke the stalemate was not a decision he made about her. Tiffany Ariana Trump was born on October 13, 1993, in Florida. Marla was 29, Trump was 47, and he had just finished the most expensive divorce in the history of New York gossip. The version Marla has told publicly is that the Long Island Railroad shooting that December shook him, that it made him reconsider what mattered, and that the proposal came out of that. It's a humane story, and she may believe it completely. The reporting says something colder was operating alongside it. According to Vanity Fair's account of this period, his parents, Fred and Mary Trump, who did not do scandal, were angry that he had fathered a child outside of marriage, and he was preparing to take his casino business public, which meant walking into rooms full of institutional investors, while his personal life was still running on the front page of the Post every other week. A wedding solved a public relations problem and a family problem in a single afternoon. Vanity Fair reports that he asked his mother what he should do about Marla. That is not a man in love asking for a blessing. That is a man asking for a recommendation. He decided to marry her. 1,000 invitations went out for the Plaza Ballroom on December 20. And then, 5 days before the wedding, with the guests already booked and the press already alerted, a document arrived. We know what was in it because a copy eventually reached a reporter. In 2019, Vanity Fair's Gabriel Sherman published an account of the 1993 prenuptial agreement based on a copy given to him by someone with access to it, including the confidential financial statements attached. The terms are not complicated. If they separated within 5 years, she got $1 million, plus another $1 million to buy a house. Child support for Tiffany was set at $100,000 a year, running until she turned 21, and terminating early if the child got a full-time job, enlisted in the military, or joined the Peace Corps. She surrendered any claim on his future wealth. And there was a confidentiality provision, an unusually thorough one, barring her from ever publishing any diary, memoir, letter, story, photograph, interview, article, essay, account, or depiction of any kind whatsoever, whether fictionalized or not, concerning the marriage. Read that list again. Whether fictionalized or not, he didn't just close the front door. He closed the novel. She had asked for $25 million. She has said publicly that the document was placed in front of her 5 days before the wedding. A source close to her told Vanity Fair she caved 24 hours before the ceremony and described her position plainly. She was under duress, and his position was that without the prenup, there was no wedding. Then there's the arithmetic buried in the financial disclosures, which is where the whole thing turns from cheap into deliberate. In that document, Trump valued himself at $1.17 billion. Marla listed $100,000 in the bank. He did not appear on the Forbes billionaires list at any point from 1990 through 1995. He had just lost the casinos, the airline, the yacht, and the plaza. Sherman's point about that inflated number is sharp and worth sitting with. If he had understated his wealth, she'd have had grounds later to argue he'd concealed assets and void the agreement. By overstating it, he made the contract harder to break. The vanity and the legal strategy were the same act. And how did she explain signing it? She told a journalist that they had basically come to an agreement that for the first few years they'd agree on something and then tear it up. Nobody tore anything up. The wedding was magnificent, and the guest list tells you who it was for. Roughly 1,000 people filled the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, a building Trump owned, or at least still had his name on, and would surrender within 2 years. Marla wore Carolina Herrera. There had already been a press conference for the marriage license, hosted by Mayor David Dinkins. Champagne opened for the cameras. The bride was 2 months postpartum and 1 day past, signing away her financial claim on the man she was about to marry. Howard Stern was there. A New York Times reporter asked him what he thought, and Stern said it was probably in bad taste, but he'd give it 4 months. He was off by about 3.5 years, and he was the most accurate guest in the room. We also now know, from photographs published by CNN in 2025, that Jeffrey Epstein walked through the plaza that night and appears grinning in the background of a group shot with other guests. State it and move on. It's a fact about the room, not about the marriage. What the marriage actually looked like from inside is harder to reconstruct, because the person who lived it signed a contract promising never to describe it. But you can read the shape of it from what she was permitted to do. She had been a working actress. She'd been on Broadway 5 months before the wedding. After the wedding, the independent career effectively ends. What replaces it is employment inside the family business. She and Trump did a cameo together on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in 1994. She co-hosted the Miss Universe pageant in 1996 and 1997, and Miss USA in 1997, pageants her husband owned. That's not a career. That's a job at your husband's company where the product is your husband's brand. And on March 10th, 1994, less than 3 months into the marriage, he explained the arrangement on national television, sitting beside her. The interview was with Nancy Collins for ABC's Primetime Live. Asked about the women in his life, he said he loved creating stars, that to a certain extent he'd done it with Ivana and to a certain extent with Marla, and that he liked that. Then, Unfortunately, after they're a star, the fun is over for him. It's a creation process, he said, almost like creating a building. He compared his wives to real estate, on camera, in the first year. On the subject of her working, he said he had days when he thought it was great, and days when, while flagging that he didn't want to sound too much like a chauvinist, he went through the roof if he came home and dinner wasn't ready. He also volunteered the broader theory that putting a wife to work is a very dangerous thing, and that it was the single greatest cause of what happened with Ivana. Set that against him telling the Washington Post 2 years earlier that it took guts for her to go on that Broadway stage and that she'd be great. Both statements are real. The difference is that one was made while he was still deciding whether to marry her, and one was made after. She sat there while he said it. That's the part of this story that never made a headline, and it's the part that does the most damage. There was a man who repeatedly explained, in public, on the record, in front of her, exactly what she was for, and a woman who had, by contract, no ability to publish a word of response. The Robin Leach interview from the same period is the one people have actually seen, because it resurfaced in 2016 and it's genuinely hard to watch. Leach, doing a Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous segment, asks Trump which features the baby inherited from each parent. Trump says she's got a lot of Marla, that she's a beautiful baby, that she's got Marla's legs. Then he gestures toward his own chest and says, they don't know whether she's got this part yet, but time will tell. The baby was 1 year old. And here is where an honest account has to slow down, because the descent was not a straight line, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. There were good years in the middle of this. Mar-a-Lago opened as a club in 1995, and the family had a life in Palm Beach. There are photographs of the three of them that do not look staged. Trump has said, and there's no reason to doubt this specific claim, that she stuck by him during the early 90s when things were genuinely bad, and things were genuinely bad. He told Howard Stern right after the divorce that she was a good person, that they'd had a great time, and that she was there when he was going through the worst of it. That's the most generous thing he ever said about her publicly, and he said it in 1999 when it cost him nothing. She was also, by several accounts, better at reading people than the family gave her credit for. According to Wall Street Journal reporting drawing on Mar-a-Lago staff recollections, Maples told employees there was something wrong with Epstein, that something was off about him, and made clear she didn't want him around her or her husband. She reportedly raised it with the man running security at Trump's Florida properties. These are staff memories recounted decades later, so hold them at that weight. But if they're accurate, the woman everyone treated as decorative was the first person in that house to say it out loud. None of that saved the marriage. What it does is explain why leaving wasn't obvious. Then came April 16, 1996, and this is the incident that gets cited constantly and understood almost never. There is a Palm Beach police incident report from that date. An officer working a deserted beach around 4 in the morning, roughly 10 minutes from Mar-a-Lago, found a man concealed under a lifeguard stand. The report identifies him as one of Trump's bodyguards, Spencer Wagner. Marla Maples came out from the dark. That is the document. Everything stacked on top of it is a different category of thing entirely. Her explanation was that Wagner was driving her home from a party, she needed a bathroom, and she'd gone onto the beach. The National Enquirer, which got the story from the officer, ran it as a scandal. Trump fired Wagner months later. Wagner then sold an account to the Globe in which he claimed they'd been intimate, a paid tabloid interview, which is the least reliable form of testimony that exists. Years afterward, his ex-wife told Inside Edition that in private he always denied it, insisted nothing happened, and that the accusation wrecked his working life. So, 1 police report and 3 incompatible stories on top of it, 2 of which were sold and 1 of which was told for free. I'm not going to pretend to resolve it, because it can't be resolved on this evidence. What matters is what the incident was worth to the person who didn't need it resolved. It handed Trump something he had not previously had, a publicly circulating reason to end the marriage that had nothing to do with him. He didn't use it right away. He waited more than a year. And when he finally moved, in May of 1997, the timing wasn't emotional at all. It was a calendar. The prenup ran on a 5-year horizon. Under 5 years, the payout was the fixed $1 million, plus the $1 million for a house. Past 5 years, the terms shifted from a flat number to a percentage of what he was worth. They married on December 20th, 1993. The separation was announced in May 1997. That's month 41, with 19 months to spare. We don't have to guess at the motive, and that's the astonishing part. Sources close to Trump told The New Yorker at the time that the split had been timed precisely to stay under the 5-year mark, and one of them explained the stakes in the plainest possible terms. That if it went from a fixed amount to a percentage, even a small percentage of a very large number is a lot of money. So they were talking about very huge things. Another source told the New York Times it would be a huge mistake to do otherwise. That unless you're married to someone you have total certainty about, you just can't do that. Maggie Haberman, in Confidence Man, makes the point that finishes it. Those quotes were anonymously placed by Trump and his lawyers. They were not a leak. They were a message. Sit with the sequence. He ended a marriage, then arranged for reporters to be told that he ended it to protect his money, while his wife of 3.5 years was legally barred from responding in any form whatsoever. That's the answer to the title. Not the affair rumors, not the tabloids. The nastiness is on paper, and he put it there himself, and then he had it read aloud to the press. In October of that same year, he published Trump, The Art of the Comeback, ghostwritten by Kate Boner and turned in 8 hours before deadline. In it, he explained both of his divorces. Ivana talked too much about work. Marla wanted him home earlier. Sadly, like so many couples these days, they drifted apart. Both ex-wives denied his accounts. Only one of them was legally free to publish a rebuttal, and it wasn't Marla. The divorce was finalized on June 8, 1999. She received roughly $2 million, half of it earmarked for buying a home, plus the child support. The confidentiality obligation survived intact. Then she did something that has been almost entirely misread for 25 years. That autumn, London's Daily Telegraph published an interview with her. In it, she said the marriage had been built on an illusion. She said Donald was never the man she wanted to marry. She said she'd finally found the courage to walk away and stay away, and that after she became a mother, she was less willing to put up with his behavior. The Telegraph also quoted her describing him as driven by ego. Within days, a spokeswoman for Maples said the interviewer had taken quotes out of context, without ever specifying which ones. Look at the mechanics of that, because it's the first time in the whole story she runs the play herself. The statement is out. It's printed. It's in every American paper by way of the New York Post. And there is a formal disavowal on the record that names nothing and retracts nothing. She got the sentence into the world and kept a defensible position on the contract. In 2000, she took the 7.45-carat Harry Winston ring, the engagement stone from 1991, the one he'd chosen, and put it up for auction. It sold for about $110,000. She gave part of the proceeds to charity. She had signed away the future wealth, the memoir, the interview, the diary, the photographs, the essay, whether fictionalized or not. She had not signed away the ring. So she sold it, publicly, and gave the money to strangers. The books never happened. In 2001, a manuscript called All That Glitters Is Not Gold was set for publication, and then quietly abandoned by both Maples and the publisher. Years later, according to page 6, there was another attempt, a project called It's About Time, with Judith Regan prepared to publish, and it reportedly died because Trump would not sign off. Treat the details of that second one as trade gossip. Treat the pattern as established. 2 manuscripts, 0 books, which means the surviving written account of that marriage, the one in libraries, is the one written by him in 8 hours in 1997, in which they drifted apart. Understand what that actually accomplishes. Ivana wrote her books. Ivana gave the deposition, sued, negotiated, published, appeared, and blamed Marla publicly for the rest of her life. Melania's terms were reportedly revised after 2016 to protect her position. Marla is the only one of the 3 who has never told her story, not because she has nothing to say, but because she has more to say than either of them, and is contractually forbidden to say it. And then, slowly, she stopped being a person the story happened to. She raised Tiffany, mostly in California, mostly out of frame. When Trump ran for president in 2016 and the tabloid decade was excavated for parts, she had every commercial incentive and every emotional justification to detonate. Every producer in New York was calling. She went on Dancing with the Stars instead, in the spring of 2016, quick-stepped to Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, and told reporters she was campaigning for a Mirrorball trophy. Trump put out a statement wishing her luck. On the Today Show in 2018, she talked about yoga and a music video shot in India. Asked whether her ex-husband had ever surprised her, she said she chooses not to judge anybody. She mentioned, almost in passing, that they had discussed a presidential run back in the 90s, and that she'd worried about what it would do to his children. She attended the inauguration, she attended her daughter's wedding at Mar-a-Lago in 2022. By 2024, she was telling a London newspaper that she'd been in caregiving mode, that her parents had passed and her daughter was settled, and that she was open to serving if called. You can read all of that as a woman who made peace. Plenty of people do. Here's the other reading, and it's the one the record supports. Silence was the only asset the agreement left her, and she has spent 25 years refusing to spend it. Every year she doesn't publish, the unpublished version gets more valuable, and she stays inside the family. The daughter carries the name. The grandson, born in 2025, is the president's. She never attacked, so she was never expelled. She is the ex-wife with no memoir, no lawsuit, no feud, no quotes, and therefore the only ex-wife whose account has never been discounted, contradicted, or picked apart, because nobody has ever heard it. Now go back to the front page. February 16th, 1990. Those 6 words made her, in the American imagination, a woman who talked too much. Cheap, indiscreet, boasting to her pals. That was the image the country carried for 35 years. And there is a real possibility, supported by a former Post reporter's recollection, and by the plain fact that Trump spent that decade feeding the tabloids stories about himself, that she never opened her mouth at all, that the loudest thing she ever supposedly said was said for her, by him, to sell papers. She spent 1990 being quoted without speaking. She has spent every year since choosing not to speak, which is a different thing entirely, and the only power the contract couldn't reach. In 2018, on a courthouse bench during jury duty, a Post reporter asked her about the headline one more time. She said she never said it. She said someone else did. Then she was asked whether it was true, and she said she wasn't going to talk about that. The truth will come out, she said, just not here. And then she winked. Her father sold real estate in a town of 600 people and served as a county commissioner, and she grew up watching a family that made its living deciding when a property goes on the market. She learned the lesson early, and she has never once broken it. The most valuable thing you own is the one you haven't sold yet. January 11th, 1936, Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church. 25 guests, a reception at the Carlisle, and a bride the American story loves. The fisherman's daughter from a Scottish island who married a millionaire builder. Look at the ship Manifest instead. May 1930, the RMS Transylvania. Occupation, one word, domestic. $50. 18 years old the day before. The honeymoon lasted 2 days. 12 years later, she nearly died, and her husband told their 11-year-old daughter to go to school anyway. 50 years after that, her signature helped move $1 billion past the IRS. It started at a dance in Queens. But before the dance, before the church, there was a village called Tong. Tong sits on the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides, about as far northwest as you can get in Britain before you run out of Britain. Mary Ann McLeod was born there on May 10, 1912, the youngest of 10 children. Her father, Malcolm, was a crofter and fisherman who also served as the compulsory attendance officer at the local school, which is a polite way of saying his job included knocking on doors and asking why somebody's kid wasn't showing up. The family spoke Gaelic. English came second, learned rather than inherited. Genealogists who have studied the family point out that the McLeods were not the poorest people on the island. Malcolm had steady work and standing. That distinction matters, and I'll come back to it, because the version of this story that gets told at political conventions tends to flatten Mary Ann into a barefoot peasant girl who stepped off a boat with nothing but a dream. She stepped off a boat with $50, a visa issued at Glasgow, 3 sisters already established in New York, and a very specific understanding of what happens to women who don't leave. Here's what that understanding was built on. In January 1919, when she was 6 years old, a naval yacht called the Iolaire ran onto the rocks at the entrance to Stornoway Harbor, carrying servicemen home from the war. More than 200 men died within sight of the shore they'd been trying to reach. The Western Isles had already lost a higher proportion of its men in the First World War than almost anywhere else in Britain. So Mary Ann grew up in a place that had run out of husbands. That's not sentimental framing. That's demographics. For a girl on Lewis in the 1920s, the available futures were roughly these: gut herring, marry someone who survived, or get on a ship. We know something about how she thought during those years, and this is the part almost nobody uses, because the source isn't American, and it isn't a Trump. In 1926, a girl in Dundee, named Agnes Stiven, won a painting competition run by a Scottish newspaper. Her name and address were printed alongside the prize. Marianne, 14 years old and hundreds of miles away, wrote to her. They became pen pals. They kept writing for years, and they met in person in Glasgow before Marianne sailed. Agnes was heading to Germany on a university scholarship, Marianne to New York. Those letters survive. A documentary team on Lewis built an entire film around them decades later. They are, as far as I can tell, the only substantial body of writing in Marianne McLeod's own hand that no member of the Trump family has ever controlled. Remember that. It becomes the last thing that matters in this story. Now, the crossing. She was issued immigration visa number 26,698 at Glasgow on February 17, 1930. She left port on May 2nd. The Transylvania docked in New York on May 11th, one day after her 18th birthday. On the alien passenger list, her stated occupation is domestic. She declared she intended to stay permanently and to become an American citizen. She had about $50, and she went to live with her older sister in Astoria, Queens. There is a competing version of all this, and it's worth 30 seconds because of who told it. Her son has said publicly that she came to America on a holiday, met Fred, and simply never left. Romantic. Also contradicted by the paperwork she personally signed on arrival. She wasn't a tourist who got swept away. She was an economic migrant who wrote down, on a federal document, that she was coming to work in other people's houses and staying for good. She did that work for roughly 5 years. The specifics are thin. There's a persistent claim that she was a maid or nanny in the Carnegie Mansion, and it may be true, but I treat it as unconfirmed rather than established. What isn't in doubt is the category. She cleaned, she minded children, she lived in the physical spaces of rich New Yorkers, while belonging to none of them. She learned, at close range and for years, exactly how wealthy American households operated. Who gave orders, who absorbed them, what a woman in charge of such a house actually did all day. That's not a tragic backstory. That's training. The Depression hit. Domestic work dried up along with everything else. And somewhere in the mid-1930s, at a party in Queens, a dance, by most accounts, she met a builder named Fred Trump. He was 5 years into a career that had started when he was practically a child. His own father had died in the 1918 influenza pandemic when Fred was 12, and Fred had gone into building young, so young that the family construction firm was incorporated under his mother's name, Elizabeth Christ Trump, because he wasn't old enough to sign contracts. E. Trump and Son. The son was doing the work. The mother held the pen. Hold on to that arrangement too. By the time Marianne met him, Fred was around 30 and selling houses in Queens for a few $1,000s apiece. Moving fast, building fast, already a man with a car and a reputation. She reportedly described him later as the most eligible bachelor in New York. That's her framing, recalled by others, and it's telling. Not the kindest man she'd met, not the funniest, the most eligible. She was assessing, and he was assessing back. Here's what a Scottish-born domestic servant offered a German-American builder in 1930s Queens. And I want to be precise about it, because this is where the standard love story stops being sufficient. Fred Trump's family spent decades telling people they were Swedish. That claim outlived Fred, outlived Marianne, and turned up in one of Donald Trump's own books. In an era when American attitudes toward Germans were about to get considerably worse, a builder with a name like Trump marrying a fair-haired Presbyterian girl from the British Isles was not a neutral event. She was, among other things, extremely useful. None of which means he didn't want her. Both things ran at once. That's the pattern for the next 63 years. We know how seriously she took it, because on a trip home to Scotland, she told her family she had met the man she was going to marry, before he had asked her. The wedding was small. 25 guests. Reverend George Arthur Buttrick, one of the more prominent Protestant preachers in America, officiated at Madison Avenue Presbyterian on the Upper East Side. The best man was Fred's younger brother John, who had a doctorate in physics from MIT. The matron of honor was Marianne's older sister. Her hometown paper, the Stornoway Gazette, ran a notice describing the bride's gown, white satin, long train, tulle cap and veil, and a bouquet of white orchids and lilies of the valley. Read that notice for what it actually is. It's a message home. The island got the satin and the orchids and the Manhattan church. The island did not get the guest list, 25 people, for a man who was already wealthy, already connected, already building at scale. This was a wedding size to be respectable, not celebrated. Then they went to Atlantic City for 2 days because Fred had deals and came back. That's the whole honeymoon. 2 days. Look, plenty of ambitious men in 1936 cut their honeymoons short. On its own, it means nothing. It means something in combination with what happened next, which is that the newlyweds moved into his mother's house. Elizabeth Christ Trump was already Mrs. Trump. She held the company's name. She was the woman whose signature made the family business legally possible. And into her household came a 23-year-old bride whose entire American resume consisted of working in other women's homes. So Mary Ann's first act as a wealthy man's wife was to live in a house she did not run, attached to a business she did not own, under the authority of a woman who had held both for a decade. She had crossed an ocean and changed classes, and the fundamental arrangement had not moved an inch. There was still someone above her deciding how the house worked. She was pregnant within a year. Mary Ann was born in April 1937, Fred Jr. the following autumn. By 1940, the census taker who came through recorded something that ought to stop you. Fred was doing well. The household income was solid. The family had moved up. And living with them, employed by them, was a Scottish domestic servant. 10 years after she signed her own name next to the word domestic, Mary Ann MacLeod Trump had a Scottish maid. That's the immigrant's success story, complete, delivered in a single line of a federal document. It's also the moment the trap closes, though nobody involved would have described it that way, and I doubt she would have either, because the thing she had acquired was a position inside a structure. Not money, money stayed with Fred. Not the company, that was Elizabeth's name, and Fred's control. A position, a role, the wife. And the role came with duties she had not yet been asked to perform. The first of those duties shows up in the biographies as a charming anecdote, and it's worth pulling apart, because the anecdote can't decide who it belongs to. The story goes that Mary Ann Trump, wife of one of the largest landlords in Brooklyn and Queens, personally drove around to the family's apartment buildings and collected the coins out of the laundry machines. Harry Hurt III put that in his 1993 book about Donald Trump and attributed it to her. Other accounts within the family attribute the same routine to Elizabeth, Fred's mother, and Donald has told a version in which he did it himself, riding along as a boy. So, which is it? Possibly all three, at different times. But notice what the confusion tells you. This is a household where the specific woman performing the task is interchangeable, and the task itself is fixed. Somebody's wife goes out with a bag and brings back the quarters. The identity of the wife is a detail. She drove a Rolls-Royce with the vanity plates MMT, Mary MacLeod Trump. That car has been offered up for 60 years as evidence of how far she came. It was also, for a period, the vehicle in which she carried laundry change. I don't think that's humiliating. I think it's clarifying. She had married into a family corporation, and she had a job in it. In March 1942, she became an American citizen. Elizabeth, her third child, was born the same year. Donald followed in 1946. And then in 1948 came the birth of Robert, and the event that I'd argue is the actual center of this marriage. Not because it was cruel in the way the word usually gets used, but because of what it revealed about how this family handled fear. Something went badly wrong after the delivery. She hemorrhaged. Doctors performed an emergency hysterectomy. Then peritonitis set in, a serious abdominal infection, and she went back into surgery again and again. Her daughter Mary Ann, speaking years later to the biographer Gwenda Blair, described 4 operations in something like 2 weeks. Mary Ann was 11. Here is what she remembered of that period, and I'm quoting her because paraphrase softens it. Her father came home and told her that her mother wasn't expected to live, but that she should go to school and he'd call if anything changed. Go to school as usual. Now hold that against the other half of the same story, which is equally documented and which most retellings leave out because it complicates the villain. Fred Trump sat on the board of Jamaica Hospital. He used that position, and one of the very few car telephones in New York at the time, to track down a surgeon from Columbia's medical school. He went and got the man himself. So he moved everything he had to save her body, and he told his 11-year-old daughter to go to school. That's not a contradiction, that's a system. In this family, a crisis is a logistics problem. You solve the logistics problem with money and contacts and speed, and the emotional content of the crisis is simply not processed by anyone, because processing it produces nothing. Fred Trump wasn't neglecting his wife. He was applying the only method he had. Mary Ann survived. She was 36 years old. She would never have another child. And the surgeries left her with damage that compounded for the rest of her life. She had recurring health problems, including bone deterioration and repeated hip surgeries in her later decades, that friends and family trace back to that year. Donald was 2. Robert was an infant. For a stretch of months, the household's mother was in a hospital that nobody was allowed to be upset about. Here's the question people always ask at this point, and it's the wrong one, but let's answer it anyway. Why didn't she leave? Leave for what? She had no money in her own name. The company was Fred's. The house was Fred's. Her citizenship was 6 years old, and she had lived through a decade in which the American government's enthusiasm for foreign-born residents fluctuated considerably. She had 5 children, a Presbyterian church that took marriage vows seriously, and an island back home where she was the great success story, the one who made it. Returning to Tong as a divorced woman with 5 children would not have been an escape. It would have been the single most public failure available to her. And I want to be careful here because there is no evidence she wanted to leave. None. No letters expressing regret about the marriage, no separation attempt, no confidant who later said she was miserable. The record does not show a woman straining at a leash. What the record shows is a woman who stopped expecting the marriage to be something other than what it was, and got to work inside it. Because in the 1950s, she got very good at the job. They moved into a 23-room house in Jamaica Estates, a colonial with columns built on Fred's own dime on land he owned, sitting above the neighborhoods he was renting out. She ran it. She also went to work on the outside world in a way that had nothing to do with laundry coins. She served on the Women's Auxiliary of Jamaica Hospital. She was involved with the Jamaica Day Nursery. She raised money for cerebral palsy causes and for programs serving adults with intellectual disabilities. The family was active with the Salvation Army, the Boy Scouts, the Lighthouse for the Blind. She wore good clothes and turned up at luncheons and shook hands and got her picture in the borough papers. Charity work. The easiest thing in the world to dismiss as a rich woman's hobby. Consider what it was actually doing. In 1954, a United States Senate committee under Homer Capehart hauled Fred Trump in over the way he had profited from federally backed housing loans, building at one cost, borrowing against a higher one, and pocketing the difference. He hadn't broken the law as it was then written. He was publicly humiliated anyway, and it cost him federal work. 19 years later, the Justice Department sued Trump management for racial discrimination against black applicants in the family's buildings. That case produced a consent decree and a permanent stain on the name. And through all of it, the Trumps were the family with the hospital auxiliary and the Boy Scout donations and the Presbyterian pew. I'm not saying her charity was cynical. By every account from people who knew her, and by the testimony of the Scottish Islands she kept funding quietly for decades, including the village hall and the local hospice, she meant it. But meaning it and being useful are not mutually exclusive, and Fred Trump did not employ people who weren't useful. She had become the part of the family the newspapers could photograph without wincing. She had a second function too, and it was the more important one. In 1955, when Donald finished Sunday school at their Presbyterian church, his mother gave him a Bible. A revised standard version with his name on it. A small, ordinary gift from a religious mother to a 9-year-old boy. Set it down somewhere. We'll need it. She was, by consistent family accounts, the performer of the household, the one with the social instinct, the sense of an audience, the enjoyment of being looked at. Donald has said flatly that he got his sense of showmanship from her. Her daughter described her as the star of family gatherings. Fred built the buildings. Mary Ann worked out what the family should look like while standing next to them. That skill matters more than the coins. Anybody can collect quarters. Very few people can take a German-American landlord under federal investigation and turn his household into a photograph nobody objects to. The one thing the system could not absorb was a child who refused to play his position. Fred Jr. was the eldest son, named for his father, expected to inherit the business. He didn't want it. He wanted to fly. And he did. He flew for TWA, he was good at it, and his father regarded the whole thing as a joke. There's a line attributed to Fred Sr. that is hardened into family legend, that Donald was worth 10 of him. Donald himself has confirmed, in his own words to a reporter in 2019, that he pressured his brother into a business Fred Jr. was never going to want, and that he regrets it. Fred Jr. drank. The drinking took the career and then took the marriage, and eventually he was living in the unfurnished attic of his parents' house in Jamaica Estates, doing maintenance work on his father's buildings. Think about that geography for a second. The mother is downstairs. The eldest son is upstairs in a room with no furniture. They are in the same building. This continued for years. On September 26, 1981, he died of a heart attack at 42. What happened that night is contested, and I'm going to flag the dispute honestly, because the most quoted version comes from an interested party. Mary L. Trump, Fred Jr.'s daughter, who was 16 when he died, who later sued the family and wrote a best-selling book denouncing them, has said that nobody went with him to the hospital, and that Donald went to a movie. Donald's people have called her book false. She has an obvious stake. So does he. Here's what isn't in dispute. Fred Trump Jr. died in a Queens hospital at 42, and in every account we have, from every side, including the family's own, there is no description of his mother being at his side. She had 5 children. She had nearly died giving birth to the last one. And when the first son she ever raised died at 42 in a hospital 10 minutes from her house, the surviving record contains a great deal about who inherited what, and nothing at all about where she was. That's the silence I keep running into. Not cruelty in the shouting sense, an institutional inability to be present for anything that couldn't be fixed. She had 32 years left. And in the last decade of them, this quiet woman with the charity luncheons and the laundry coins stopped being the thing the family displayed, and became something considerably harder to explain away. On the afternoon of October 31st, 1991, Mary Ann Trump was shopping near a supermarket in Queens, not far from home. She was 79. A teenager knocked her to the ground and took her handbag. There were $14 in it. A man named Lawrence Herbert, 44, driving a truck for Wonder Bread, saw it happen, jumped out, and chased the kid into the underground passage of an apartment building. The kid threw the bag at him, and Herbert recovered it, the $14 and her papers still inside. Police arrested a 16-year-old named Paul Locasto, who was later sentenced to 3 to 9 years. She was left with fractured ribs, a brain hemorrhage, and permanent damage to her sight and her hearing. Her son Donald invited Lawrence Herbert and his family to dinner at the Plaza, offered him a job, and gave him a check. 9 years later, Donald opened a chapter of his book about crime in America with what had happened to his mother. That mugging is one of the very few times Mary Ann Trump appears in the public record, as a person events happened to rather than a woman standing beside her husband in a photograph. And by the time it reached print, it had been converted into a policy argument. I want to be exact about the sequence now, because the sequence is the whole story. She was assaulted in the autumn of 1991. She never fully recovered. And the following year, in 1992, the Trump family incorporated a company called All County Building Supply and Maintenance. All County had no real offices. Its listed address belonged to a family confidant. Its stated purpose was to buy boilers, cleaning supplies, appliances, everything Fred Trump's buildings needed. It did no such thing. What it did, according to the New York Times investigation that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2019, was take purchases Fred's own employees had already made and mark them up, sometimes by 20%, sometimes by 50%, sometimes by double. The inflated money flowed to All County's owners, who were Fred and Mary Ann's children and a cousin. Untaxed. Gifts wearing the costume of invoices. There was a second beneficiary. Fred Trump used those padded numbers to justify raising rents in rent-regulated buildings. Tenants in Brooklyn and Queens paid more so that the landlord's children could receive money without paying gift tax on it. And in 1995, Fred and Mary Ann each executed a trust arrangement that transferred the empire to the children while valuing that empire, on paper, at $41.4 million. The actual worth was closer to $1 billion. The Times reported that Fred and Mary Trump transferred more than $1 billion in wealth to their children. The tax bill on that should have been in the neighborhood of $550 million. They paid $52.2 million. Trump's attorney denied there was any fraud or tax evasion and called the reporting inaccurate. New York State's tax department opened an investigation. Here is the part that changes this story permanently. Mary Ann Trump was not a bystander to any of it. She was a signatory. The instruments moved because she signed them. The domestic servant from the Transylvania, who arrived with $50 and wrote one word about herself on a federal form, spent the last decade of her life co-executing the largest documented tax maneuver in her family's history, while partially blind and partially deaf from a mugging over $14. I don't offer that as an accusation. I offer it as a correction. Every version of this woman that circulates in American culture treats her as an object. The immigrant Cinderella, the charity volunteer, the sweet Scottish mother, the woman things happen to. The paperwork says she was a principal. Whatever the marriage cost her in 1948, by the 1990s, she was not being managed. She was a party. Fred Trump had been slipping into dementia for years by then. He died on June 25, 1999, at 93. The bulk of the estate went in equal shares to the 4 surviving children. Each grandchild got $200,000. Fred Jr.'s 2 children, Fred III and Mary, contested the will, arguing their grandfather had been unduly influenced in his final years. The family's response is the single hardest fact in this entire account. They cut off the medical insurance the family foundation had been providing to Fred Jr.'s children. At that moment, Fred III had a newborn son, born within hours of Fred Sr.'s funeral, who was having seizures and needed months of intensive neonatal care. The later lawsuit described the move as unfathomable cruelty. It was, transparently, leverage. Mary Ann Trump was alive for all of it. She died on August 7, 2000, at 88, and her great-grandson's coverage had been used as a bargaining chip against her son's children while she was living. We have no record of her objecting. We also have no record of her being asked. That's the honest position, and I'm not going to improve it. The family got its settlement in 2001. Fred III and Mary took the money, and signed a confidentiality agreement along with it, which should have been the end. It wasn't, and the reason it wasn't is almost funny. The New York Times found the thread not through a leak or a whistleblower, but through a public document. A financial disclosure form Mary Ann Trump Barry had filed, unredacted, during her confirmation to the federal bench. A reporter searching for something else spotted a contribution of $1 million to an entity called All County Building Supply and Maintenance, and thought, what on earth is that? The family's own paperwork opened the family's books. Mary Ann retired from the bench in 2019, which halted a judicial misconduct inquiry into whether she'd participated in the schemes. Then she was secretly recorded by her niece calling her brother a liar with no principles. Donald sued that niece and the Times for $100 million. Mary L. Trump's own suit was dismissed in 2022 on the strength of the release she'd signed back in 2001. So the settlement held, the archive stayed sealed, the NDA did its work, and every consequential fact about this family's monies reached the public anyway, extracted from documents the Trumps themselves generated and filed. Which brings us back to Scotland. In 1995, an elderly woman in Dundee, named Agnes Stiven, was watching a television documentary about a New York developer called Donald Trump. Somewhere in it, his mother's maiden name came up. Agnes had lost touch with her teenage pen pal roughly 60 years earlier, when one of them sailed for New York and the other left for Germany. She recognized her. They reconnected and stayed in contact until Mary Ann's death in 2000. Agnes kept the letters, the ones a 14-year-old girl on Lewis had written to a stranger in Dundee, and the ones that came after. Decades later, a filmmaker on the Isle of Lewis built a documentary around them. Nobody in the Trump family signed off on that. Nobody bought it, sealed it, or made anyone sign anything. The only substantial body of Mary Ann McLeod's own words that survives outside her husband's world survives, because a girl who won a painting contest in 1926 held on to her mail, and because a woman who had crossed an ocean and changed classes and buried a son and signed the papers still wanted, at 83, to hear from someone who had known her before any of it. Now look at the wedding again. January 1936, 25 people at the Carlisle. White satin, a long train, orchids and lilies of the valley, all of it faithfully reported back to Stornoway. The island read it as arrival. What it actually was a bride from the servant class marrying into a family firm registered in another woman's name, then moving into that woman's house, then spending 63 years inside an organization that could arrange a Columbia surgeon by car phone in a single afternoon and could not manage to sit at a hospital bed. That's the marriage. Not a romance that failed, and not a horror story either. A merger, entered knowingly by both parties, in which she supplied respectability and a photogenic face, and eventually a signature, and he supplied everything else and set every term. She was never conned. She was recruited. On January 20th, 2017, her son placed his hand on a Bible she had given him in 1955, when he was 9, and swore the presidential oath. She had been dead 17 years. It's the only possession of hers that has ever appeared on the steps of the Capitol. A gift that costs nothing, proves nothing, and can be photographed. She'd have understood exactly why they chose it. The day they buried Robert Trump, his wife of 25 years, wasn't there. She hadn't been invited. Neither had the son he adopted. She posted a photograph instead, the two of them renewing their vows at the Graceland Wedding Chapel in Las Vegas. America knew them as the nice Trumps, gentle Robert, gracious Blaine, the ones who didn't shout. What America didn't know was the $3.7 million house on Long Island, bought for his secretary. Or the settlement he offered her, then pulled off the table. The family got the funeral. She had the photograph. It began at a Christie's fundraiser. He told the story himself years later to People magazine, and he told it the way men tell stories about the best decision they ever made. He saw her across the room. He made a beeline to find out who she was. That was 1980. By her own account, posted in her own words 4 decades later, the ride started that year and ended in 2009, which is a strange way to describe a marriage, and we'll come back to it. Here's what matters about that room. It was a benefit, not a boardroom, not a construction site, not Atlantic City, a charity event, the kind of event where New York decides who is acceptable. Robert Trump had spent his life inside a family that generated money and headlines in roughly equal amounts, and had almost no social credibility to show for either. Blaine had no money at all. What she had was the thing the Trumps could not buy in Brooklyn. So before we get to what the marriage cost her, understand what she was walking into and understand what she brought. She was born Martha Lindley Blaine Beard in Mountain Brook, Alabama, an old money suburb outside Birmingham, though the Beards were not old money. Census records point to 1948, which would make her almost exactly Robert's age. Some later profiles list 1957, and that discrepancy is worth noticing in a woman who spent her adult life managing how she was perceived. Her father, Joseph Beard, was an IBM executive. That's the entire origin of her worldliness. Not inheritance, a corporate transfer. When she was around 10, IBM sent him to Japan, and the family moved to Yokohama. She went to the International School of the Sacred Heart. And this is where the useful part of her childhood happens, because a tall, blonde American girl in 1960s Japan is not a person who blends in. She told people decades afterward that strangers commented on her eyes, her hair, her height, that she prayed to wake up shorter, and that she once had her hair dyed black so she'd match. She walked back through the door and her mother started crying. Hold on to that. A child who understood, at 10, that being looked at is a condition you either suffer or manage. She chose to manage it. The rest of the education reads like a resume assembled for social use. The American School of Paris. Bennett College, a small women's school in Millbrook, New York, file that town away. The University of Tokyo, which she left before finishing. She left it to get married. In 1970, she married a man named Peter Retchen. In 1978, they had a son, Christopher. Then they divorced, and she landed in Manhattan in the very early 80s as a woman in her early 30s with a small boy, no degree, no fortune, and a job at Christie's, the auction house, which is a business built entirely on knowing which objects and which people are worth something. She was good at it. That's not an interpretation. Within a few years, Women's Wear Daily was calling her the Nouvelle Société's ingenue, and the New York Times ran a full profile in October 1987 under the headline, The Winning Ways of Blaine Trump. She was 39, and she had a Times profile about her charm. Robert Trump, who ran a considerable amount of his family's actual business, never got one. That's the trade. Let's stop pretending it was invisible to anyone involved. She got a name that opened doors, a husband who was reportedly kind, and the part that mattered most to a divorced mother with a 5-year-old, stability. Robert eventually adopted Christopher, who became Christopher Trump Retchen. That's not a gesture. That's a legal act with permanent consequences, and it is the single strongest piece of evidence in the entire record that this man genuinely loved this woman and her child. Remember it. It will be the last thing anyone honors. And what did the family get? The Trumps, in 1984, were not a dynasty. They were an outer borough landlord operation with a loud second son who had just started buying his way into Manhattan. Fred Trump built apartment houses in Queens and Brooklyn and lived in Jamaica Estates. Donald was busy becoming a spectacle. What none of them had was a member who could walk into a museum benefit and be welcomed rather than tolerated. Blaine could. Blaine was welcomed. They married in 1984. And here is where the shape of the arrangement becomes visible. Because it wasn't a wedding that turned this into a merger. It was the division of labor that started immediately afterward, and it never changed for 25 years. Robert handled money in silence. He worked for the family, managing property, later the casinos. He was known inside the organization as the nice one, the approachable one, the Trump who did not humiliate employees for sport. Blaine handled the public. Galas, boards, receiving lines, photographs. American Ballet Theater, Memorial Sloan Kettering. Charity after charity, year after year, until she was one of the most recognizable social figures in New York. A woman who, by her own telling, preferred to sign things Blaine Beard, or just Miss Blaine, because signing Blaine Trump invited strangers to pitch her husband on bathroom fixtures. She said that in 1998, as a joke about privacy. It reads differently now. She had another name available and she used it. Understand what that division actually meant in practice, though, because it wasn't a marriage of equals with different hobbies. He owned things, she attended things. His work generated assets in his name. Her work generated goodwill in the family's name. When New York Magazine later got around to assessing the two of them, the social chronicler David Patrick Columbia observed that she was far better connected than her husband, and then added, almost as an afterthought, that she'd be well fixed enough to keep her apartment and her dinner parties. That is what a woman's 25-year contribution sounded like to the people who watched it happen. Dinner parties. Meanwhile, the family she'd married into ran on rules nobody wrote down. Fred Trump controlled the money and the children's positions in the business until he was physically incapable of controlling anything. Loyalty was measured in silence. And the household drama, the part everyone now knows, was already a decade old before Blaine arrived. Fred Jr., Freddie, the eldest son, the one who tried to leave and become a pilot, had died in 1981, at 42, an alcoholic. He left 2 children. Nobody in that family talked about it. Robert had watched his older brother be broken by their father and had drawn the obvious conclusion, which was to never resist anything. Blaine married the one who didn't resist. That felt safe in 1984. In 1985, a hospice volunteer named Ganga Stone started delivering meals to a man dying of AIDS in New York, and the operation she built out of that became God's Love We Deliver. It was, in the mid-'80s, radioactive. AIDS charity work was not a reputational asset. It was the thing polite New York crossed the street to avoid. Blaine Trump took it on and did not let go of it for the next 40 years. She raised money for it, chaired for it, and eventually became vice chair of the board. Whatever else you decide about her, that decision was made when it cost something, and by 1998 the city gave her the Marietta Tree Award for public service. So we now have the picture the public had. A gentle husband. A wife who fed dying strangers. The decent Trumps. 15 years after she signed on to feed the sick, her husband and his siblings would cut off the medical coverage of a disabled infant in their own family, a baby with seizures, and describe his round-the-clock care, in a legal filing, as expensive babysitting. She was still hosting the gala. She was still hosting the gala, and that is not a cheap shot. That is the arrangement working exactly as designed. But before the will, before the lawsuit, there was 1990, which was the year the family's public face stopped being a courtesy and became a necessity. 2 things happened to the Trumps that spring. The first was Atlantic City. Donald had bought and built the Taj Mahal at a cost of roughly $1 billion, financed with junk bonds, and after 3 of his top casino executives died in a helicopter crash in 1989, he put his younger brother in charge of getting the place open. Robert Trump, a property manager from Brooklyn, was handed the largest casino in the world. It opened on April 2, 1990, and the slot machines could not be counted. The financial controls weren't in place, the machines kept jamming and going dark. Regulators wouldn't let large sections of the floor operate. Donald told Larry King the machines were simply too hot, too busy, overwhelmed by success. New Jersey's own gaming records tell a different story. Within 16 days, the Taj had already run 4 days with less than nothing in its account, once nearly $1.7 million in the hole. By June, the state was checking the casino's bank balance daily. What happened between the brothers that week comes to us mainly through John R. O'Donnell, a Trump casino executive who published a book about it in 1991, an angry insider with a grievance and a publisher, so weigh it accordingly. O'Donnell described Donald turning on Robert in front of staff and blaming him for the machines. What isn't in dispute is the aftermath. Robert stepped back from Atlantic City, and the brothers were reportedly not on speaking terms for a long stretch afterward. So, the husband humiliated in public by his own brother, in a business he never asked to run. The second thing that happened in 1990 was that Donald's marriage detonated across the front page of every tabloid in New York, with Ivana on one side and Marla Maples on the other, and the whole thing playing out like a serialized novel for months. Now, look at what that does to Blaine. Overnight, the only Trump marriage that could be photographed without embarrassment was hers. The only Trump wife who could stand at a podium and be applauded was hers. Her value to the family stopped being social decoration and became something closer to damage control. The nicer the Trumps needed to appear, the more the family needed the woman who fed people dying of AIDS. That is a real form of power. It is also a leash. A person whose worth to a family is her public presentability cannot afford a public rupture, and everybody in the room understands that arithmetic without anyone ever saying it out loud. The 90s are the part you compress, because the pattern doesn't change, it just accumulates. She chairs, she raises, she appears. She and Robert acquire a sprawling 3-floor apartment on the Upper East Side, 6,500 square feet across 3 combined units, the kind of place people buy when they intend to stay. Christopher grows up a Trump on paper. Robert works. In 1998, New York gives her the Marietta Tree Award, and People runs a profile in which her husband delivers that beeline line about the fundraiser. Read what he says again. He describes seeing her. He describes finding out who she was. 14 years into a marriage, the anecdote he reaches for is the moment she was still an object of curiosity across a room. That's not damning. Plenty of husbands tell that story. It's just the only story he ever told publicly about her. And by then, there was a great deal more available. Then Fred Trump died, in June 1999, and the family showed everyone what it actually was. The will divided the empire among the 4 surviving children, Mary Ann, Donald, Elizabeth, and Robert, and left the children of the dead eldest son, Freddie, with a fraction of what they expected. Mary Trump and her brother, Fred Trump III, challenged it in Queen Surrogate's Court in March 2000. That's the ordinary, boring part. Estates get contested. Here's what happened next. Fred III's third child, a boy named William, had been born that June, hours after his great-grandfather's funeral. At 18 hours old, he began having seizures. He needed extraordinary, continuous medical care. And like everyone in the family, he was covered by the Trump Company health plan. Weeks after the will was challenged, Fred III received a certified letter. The family's medical coverage was being terminated, effective the 1st of May. The uncles and aunt, Donald, Mary Ann, and Robert, argued in their response that the baby did not require round-the-clock attention, and called it expensive babysitting. They suggested the father take a CPR course from the Red Cross. They noted that a thank you would be appreciated. Donald was asked about it directly by Heidi Evans of the Daily News, and he did not hide behind a lawyer. When his nephew sued them, he said, they asked themselves why they should keep giving him medical coverage. Asked whether that seemed cold, he said he couldn't help that. It's cold when somebody sues your father. The case settled in 2001. The terms are sealed under a confidentiality clause, which is the third act of the family method and the most important one. Withdraw the money, apply the pressure until the other side folds, then buy silence as part of the deal. Robert Trump was a named defendant. The nice one. He signed on to all of it. There is no evidence, none, that Blaine intervened, objected, or said a word about any of it. I'm not going to invent a conscience for her that the record doesn't support. What I can tell you is what she was doing during those same months, which was raising money to deliver meals to sick people who couldn't feed themselves under the name Trump, while the Trumps cut a disabled infant off his insurance to win a probate fight. Both things were her life. She lived inside the contradiction for a year and a half and kept chairing the dinner. And this is the moment to answer the obvious question, because it's about to matter enormously. Why stay? Not because she was trapped in the old-fashioned sense. It was 2001, not 1901. She could have walked out any morning. She stayed because everything she had was inside that name. The apartment was marital property in a marriage where the assets were his. Her son's legal father was Robert. Her board seats, her galas, her entire professional identity as one of New York's great fundraisers ran on the social credit the name generated. She had built a real career, and it was, in a legal sense, unbanked. She'd watched this family destroy people who challenged it. She had just watched them do it to a baby. Somewhere in this stretch, She never gave the date. The two of them flew to Las Vegas and renewed their wedding vows at the Graceland Wedding Chapel. We know because she said so herself, decades later, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Two people who could have rented any room in Manhattan, who had spent 20 years inside the most rigidly image-managed family in New York, went to a kitschy Elvis chapel on the Strip and did it again with nobody watching. That's the closest thing to a private moment this couple ever left behind. It reads like affection. It probably was affection. It's also the tell. Nobody renews a vow that's holding. In October 2004, Blaine Trump was admitted to Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan after an overdose. Accounts of what happened differ, and I'm going to give you both. Contemporary tabloid reporting described it as accidental, too much of something, taken by mistake. Later summaries of the same episode describe it plainly as an attempt on her own life. The record does not settle it, and the people who could settle it have not. What is not disputed is what she had just found out. Robert had bought a house on Long Island. $3.7 million in Garden City. It was not for them. It was for Anne Marie Palan, who had worked as his secretary for years, and who was, by that point, his girlfriend. 20 years of marriage. 20 years of standing in receiving lines with his surname pinned to her, of being the family's proof of decency, of building him a reputation he could not have manufactured himself in 100 years of paying for it. And he had gone out and bought another woman a house. According to page 6, Blaine's response, after the hospital, after everything, was to try to save the marriage. She wanted to repair it. She was prepared to stay. Robert wasn't interested. That refusal is the hinge of the whole story, and it's worth being precise about why. Up to that point, every choice she'd made was the choice a woman makes when the door is still open. Absorb it, manage it, keep the machinery running. She'd done it for 2 decades. She was ready to do it again after the worst humiliation of her life, which tells you something uncomfortable about how deep the arrangement went. He closed the door. He didn't want repair. He wanted the other house. So she stopped being the family's public face and became, for the first time in 25 years, a party with interests. Watch what she does. It's methodical and it's fast. In May 2006, the enormous apartment, the 3 units, 3 floors, 6,500 square feet, still unfinished after all those years, went on the market. That's the first visible ACT. Not a statement, not a leak, not a tearful interview. A real estate listing. In this family, property is the only language anybody speaks fluently, and putting the marital home up for sale is how you announce a divorce to people who don't read feelings. Then she hired Robert Stephen Cohen. If that name means nothing to you, it meant everything in New York. Cohen was the divorce lawyer, the one the Times would eventually describe as among the most important in the country, the man who taught a course at Penn Law called Anatomy of a Divorce. You do not hire Bob Cohen to be treated gently. You hire him because you have decided the other side is going to be made to pay, and you want the person the other side is most afraid of. In June 2007, she hosted her son's wedding, Christopher Trump Retchen, the boy Robert had adopted, married that summer with the announcement running in the Times. She did it as the marriage was ending. She did it under the name. And then she filed. What happened next is the ugliest documented moment in the entire 25 years, and it did not involve another woman. Robert offered her a settlement. Then he took it back. A friend of hers described it to the New York Post with a bluntness that still lands. He offered a settlement and then, for reasons unknown, yanked it off the table, so she was forced into court to get her fair share. They'd been married more than 2 decades. She helped build his business, and now he was balking at giving her anything. Think about what withdrawing an offer actually does. It doesn't save money. The litigation costs a fortune. It buys leverage through exhaustion. It's the same instrument the family had used on Fred III 7 years earlier. Take away the thing the other side needs, wait, and let the pressure do the work. She didn't fold. That's the answer to the question this whole story has been circling. She went to court in 2008 against a man whose fortune was estimated in the neighborhood of $200 million, and she stayed there until 2010 when they reached a settlement whose terms were sealed. Sealed. Confidential. Exactly like the deal that ended the fight over the baby's insurance. The Trumps buy silence. It's not a personality trait, it's a procedure. In December 2007, while the filings were still fresh New York Magazine ran a piece on the divorce and quoted David Patrick Columbia saying she was far more connected than Robert was, and that she'd be well fixed enough to keep her apartment and her dinner parties. It was meant as reassurance. It reads now as the most accurate line anyone wrote about the case, though not for the reason he intended. He was right that she kept the connections. He simply misunderstood that the connections were the asset, that the thing she'd spent 25 years building in someone else's name was portable, and the money wasn't the only thing she was walking away with. Then they divided the map. In 2012, she put a mansion in Millbrook, New York, on the market for $17.5 million. A country property so unlike anything associated with that surname that a real estate blog ran it under the headline, "The oh-so-very un-Trump mansion of socialite Blaine Trump." Millbrook is where Bennett College was. It's the town where she'd been a student before the first marriage, before Christopher, before any of it. She sold it. The following year, 2013, Robert Trump moved to Millbrook and spent the rest of his life there. I'm not going to tell you what either of them meant by that, because nobody wrote it down. What I can tell you is that she left, and he arrived, and the town where a girl once went to college became the place a retired Trump was remembered by neighbors as a gentle hobby farmer who turned up at the Millbrook Diner and gave money to local animal charities. His obituary in the local paper called him a quiet man who never craved exposure and got the first wife's name wrong. Meanwhile, she rebuilt in plain sight. A partner, Steve Simon, an entrepreneur she met at a Miami Heat game, introduced, of all people, by Pat Riley. An apartment that Architectural Digest photographed and published in December 2016. The boards, the galas, the vice chairmanship at God's Love We Deliver, which by now had grown into one of the most respected charities in the city. And in January 2017, she went to Washington and attended the inauguration ball. Vogue covered her doing it. That's the part people find hardest to square. Divorced 8 years, dragged through court, and there she is in the ballroom while her ex-brother-in-law becomes president. But it fits the pattern precisely. She had never been sentimental about that family, and she wasn't sentimental now. The name still opened rooms. She still knew exactly what a room was worth. Then, in the summer of 2020, everything in this story converged inside 8 weeks. In June, Robert Trump went to court to stop Mary Trump from publishing a book about the family, invoking the confidentiality clause from that 2001 estate settlement. The suppression machinery deployed one last time by the nice one against his dead brother's daughter. He lost. In March of that same year, he had married Anne Marie Palan, 16 years after the house. On August 15, 2020, he died at 71. There was a funeral. It was held at the White House. Blaine Trump was not invited. Neither was Christopher, the son Robert had chosen to adopt, given his name to, raised. Look at that decision honestly. A family that had spent 40 years using this woman's respectability, that had put her on every stage where it needed to appear humane, decided that at the moment of highest visibility, she had no standing at all. And the son wasn't collateral damage. Removing him was the point. The adoption had been the one act in this marriage that couldn't be explained by advantage. And the family unmade it in an afternoon by controlling a guest list. They controlled the funeral. They did not control what she did next. On the day of the service, she went on Instagram, where she had a public audience she had spent decades cultivating, and posted a photograph of the two of them renewing their vows at the Graceland Wedding Chapel. She wrote that it reminded her of that day. She thanked him for the memories and called it a great ride, starting in 1980, ending in 2009. She said she and Christopher were sad not to be included, but would be there in spirit. Godspeed, Robert. Not one accusatory word, not one mention of the house in Garden City, the withdrawn settlement, the 2 years in court, the sealed file. Just a picture of a man and a woman in a tacky Las Vegas chapel, published on the morning the family was busy burying him without her. It went everywhere. It was, for most people, the only image of that marriage they ever saw. Every outlet that ran the funeral ran her photograph beside it, and the story that emerged was not the one the family had arranged in Washington. It was hers. That's the reversal. The Trumps have always understood how to control access to the money, to the will, to the insurance, to the courtroom record, to the church. What they never learned was that controlling access isn't the same as controlling the story. Blaine had spent her entire adult life in the one part of the business they considered decorative, the room, the photograph, the audience. It turned out to be the only part that survives. 3 years later, the invitations went out for the annual Golden Heart Awards, the dinner she'd been hosting for God's Love We Deliver for years. The letter to supporters was signed Blaine Beard, the name she'd used at 20, the one she told people she preferred because signing the other one invited strangers to make requests of her husband. For 39 years, she kept the surname because it was worth something, and she gave it back the moment it wasn't. Look at the chapel photograph again. In 1990, it would have been proof of a happy marriage. In 2004, it was a receipt for one being repaired. On the day of the funeral, it was the only piece of Robert Trump's life she still owned outright. And she published it, not to wound him, and not, I think, to lie about him either. There was real affection in that marriage. There was a man who adopted her child. Both things are in the record. And the record also shows him buying another woman a house and then withdrawing a settlement to make his wife of 25 years fight for the value of her own labor. The girl who dyed her hair black at 10 so people would stop looking at her spent the next 60 years deciding exactly how she'd be seen. They buried him without her. She published the wedding.